She gave him 10 years. 10 years of blood, strategy, and sleepless nights building a kingdom that now bears his name alone. And tonight, in front of every lord, general, and noble who ever watched her hold this empire together with bare hands, he's going to stand at that banquet table and make the one choice that cannot be undone. Some men are conquered by enemies. The dangerous ones are conquered by their own blindness. Stay until the end, because this story isn't about a king who lost his Luna. It's about a Luna who found herself. Drop your city in the comments. Let's begin. 10 years. That was the number Selene Ravenwood counted in the bones of her feet as she walked the length of the Ashbourne Palace's east corridor, the one with black marble floors and iron sconces that threw amber light across the walls. She had been the one who chose this corridor's stone. She had stood in a quarry outside the capital city 3 winters ago, mud on her boots, rain on her face, arguing with the head architect because the original pale limestone felt weak, felt like apology, felt like a palace that wasn't certain it deserved to exist. She had won that argument. The black marble had been installed, and now the hallway that led to the throne room looked exactly the way a kingdom's heart should look, unyielding, old, certain of itself. She could not say the same for anything else tonight. Outside the tall, narrow windows, the Moonfire Empire's capital blazed. The city of Eltharion had been lit from end to end for the coronation banquet. Lanterns lined every bridge over the Ashbourne River. The great plaza before the palace was dense with celebrating citizens who had waited years for this night. The formal union of their king and his Luna, the final piece of a reign that had clawed its way through 2 border wars, 1 internal rebellion, and more political betrayals than most historians would ever accurately count. Selene had been present for all of it. She walked now in a gown the color of deep water, her dark hair wound tight against the back of her skull. No crown yet. That was the point of the ceremony. She would receive it at the banquet, presented by Riker's own hands, in front of every power that had come to witness the Moonfire Empire's formal consolidation. Lords from the Eastern Territories, war generals who had bled beside the king in the mountain campaigns, envoys from 3 neighboring kingdoms who were there to make trade agreements contingent on the empire's political stability. Her presence was the stability. Everyone in that building knew it, including Selene. She paused at the top of the staircase that descended into the banquet hall's entrance corridor and pressed one hand flat against the cold iron railing. Not because she was nervous. She had stopped being nervous about rooms full of powerful men sometime in the 2nd year of Riker's reign, when she had walked into a war council table where every general believed she had no business speaking, opened her mouth, and turned a losing defensive strategy into a campaign that saved the northern flank. No, she was not nervous. She was listening. The habit had kept her alive through too many palace dangers to abandon. And right now, the noise rising from the banquet hall below felt wrong, in a way she couldn't fully name. There was laughter where there should have been formal murmur. There was a quality to the energy, a breathless, watching quality that belonged to crowds anticipating a spectacle rather than a ceremony. Selene closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she descended the stairs. The banquet hall of Ashbourne Palace seated 400. Tonight it held 460, every extra body pressed into the standing gallery that ringed the upper walls. Every face turned toward the center of the room where the long royal table stretched beneath 3 iron chandeliers burning with enchanted blue-white flame. The tables flanking it were already filled, the high lords and their consorts, the generals and their ranks. The foreign envoys seated in precise order of political priority, everyone arranged exactly as Selene had specified to the palace steward 6 weeks prior. She noted all of this in the time it took her to cross half the room. She noted something else, too. There was a woman she had never seen seated at the table's right hand, seated where Selene was meant to sit. The woman was young, not a girl, but young, perhaps 6 or 7 years younger than Selene's 29. She had the kind of face that courts described as remarkable without being able to articulate why. The features individually unremarkable, but the sum of them arranged with a precision that drew the eye and held it. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, worn loose over one shoulder. Her gown was amber silk. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her chin at an angle that was precisely engineered to appear modest, while ensuring that every person who looked at her understood she was entirely aware of being watched. Selene had been trained to read people by the best political minds in the empire. She read this woman in 4 seconds. Then she looked across the table to where Riker Ashbourne sat in the high-back throne chair at the head of the table, and for one moment, across the width of that glittering hall, their eyes met. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Riker Ashbourne was 34 years old, built like a man who had never entirely left the battlefield behind, wide through the shoulder, a scar along his jaw that he'd stopped trying to hide 3 years ago when she had told him, bluntly, that it made him look like someone who had survived something, and survival was more impressive than pretty. His hair was dark, kept short at the sides, and he wore the formal crown of the Moonfire Empire, iron and obsidian, shaped like a winter ridge, with the uncomfortable ease of a man who had earned authority rather than inherited it. He was, by every measurable standard, the most powerful alpha on the continent, and right now he was looking at Selene with an expression she had never seen on him before. Careful. He was watching her face carefully, as if bracing for the precise moment her understanding arrived. Selene walked the rest of the room without hurrying. She reached the edge of the royal table and stopped, and the hum of conversation around them dropped by half, because these were people who had watched the king and his Luna navigate political situations for a decade, and they knew the particular weight of a silence between those two. "Riker," she said. "Selene." His voice was even. She had always envied his voice. It never gave him away. She looked at the woman seated beside him, looked back at Riker. Her own voice came out quieter than she intended, not from weakness, but from the effort of making it civil. "There appears to be a misunderstanding with the seating." "No misunderstanding," he gestured. Not to the seat beside the woman, not to her rightful place, but toward a chair 3 seats down the table. "Sit, please. I'll explain." The room held its breath. Selene did not sit. "You'll explain now," she said. "Or I'll stand here until every person in this room understands that something has gone wrong." Riker's jaw tightened. It was the only tell he had, that tightening, and she had cataloged it over years. It meant he was cornered, and he knew it. He pushed back his chair and stood, and his height alone brought the room to full silence. "Lords and ladies of the court," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of that hall without strain. "Generals, honored envoys, I thank you for your presence on this historic night." He paused. "There will be an adjustment to the evening's formal proceedings." The pause that followed had weight, physical weight. "The mating ceremony has been postponed," the room erupted. Not loudly. These were trained political creatures, most of them, people who understood that uncontrolled reaction was a display of weakness. But the eruption happened in the body language, in the sharp intake of breath, in the way 3 of the Eastern Lords exchanged exactly the kind of look that meant alliances were being mentally renegotiated in real time, in the way General Harwick at the far end of the table set down his goblet with a care that was itself a statement, and in the way the woman in amber silk, Lady Aurelia Thorne, Selene would learn her name before the hour was out, allowed herself a single small smile that she smoothed away before anyone else could register it. Selene registered it. "Lady Aurelia Thorne," Riker continued, "will be residing at the palace under my personal protection, effective immediately. She and I have matters of significant importance to address. This transition will have no bearing on the Empire's stability or on the loyalty I bear to this court." He sat down. He did not look at Selene again. And that, not the announcement, not the postponement, not the presence of another woman in her seat, that was the thing that cracked something deep inside Selene Ravenwood's chest. Not his words, not his choices, his refusal to face her, because Riker Ashbourne faced everything. He had faced war councils that wanted him dead. He had faced a betrayal by his own brother 3 years ago without flinching. He had stood in a burning village on the western border and given orders with bodies around him and not looked away from a single face. And he could not look at her, which meant he already knew what he was doing, which meant this was not impulse. This had been decided. Selene stood at that table for 3 breaths. 3 full breaths, which was long enough for every person in that room to understand that she was not going to break, was not going to cry, was not going to provide the spectacle some of them might have been anticipating. Then she pulled out the chair 3 seats down and sat in it, folded her hands on the table, and lifted her eyes to the far wall. The banquet continued. Nobody at that table ate with any real appetite. She heard the whispering begin within the first 20 minutes, quiet enough to be deniable, loud enough to be deliberate. The court of the Moonfire Empire had a specific architecture for cruelty. It operated through suggestion and implication, through careful looks and misplaced questions, through the particular social technique of pitying someone in public in a way that performed sympathy while delivering humiliation. She had navigated this machinery for years, usually from a position of enough power to render it irrelevant. Tonight, the machinery was aimed at her. Lord Cassius Vane, whose estate taxes she had negotiated down 2 years ago, leaned toward his wife and murmured something that made her press her fingers to her mouth. Lady Fortane of the Southern Territories watched Selene with the specific expression worn by women who have been waiting for a rival's fall. Even some of the generals who had served alongside her in strategy sessions managed to arrange their faces into expressions that suggested she had become, in the space of a single announcement, someone to be uncertain about. And Aurelia Thorne spoke quietly to Riker all through dinner. Selene watched without watching. She had learned this skill early, her eyes on the middle distance, her awareness on the periphery, tracking a conversation across a table without appearing to track it. She could not hear what Aurelia said, not across that distance and noise, but she could watch how Riker listened. And what she saw in that watching cost her more than anything said aloud that night. He leaned in. It was subtle. The man was an alpha, trained never to display vulnerability of posture in public, but he leaned in, fractionally, in the way people lean toward voices they have decided to trust. His face, which in Selene's experience was generally arranged in the controlled neutral of a man managing 400 simultaneous political calculations, softened when Aurelia spoke, not into warmth exactly, into something more dangerous than warmth, into relief, as if Aurelia's voice was the sound of tension leaving his body. Selene looked down at her plate. She was not going to interpret that tonight. She was not going to let herself sit in a room full of watching eyes and begin picking apart the image of Riker Ashbourne finding relief in another woman's voice. That was a wound she would examine in private, where nobody could see what shape it made. She ate. She spoke, when spoken to, with exactly the level of composure that made it impossible for anyone to accuse her of distress. She endured 2 hours of a banquet that had been intended to celebrate the crowning of her life, and instead had become the public announcement of her replacement, and she did it without displaying a single crack. It was the hardest thing she had done in 10 years, harder than the war councils, harder than the border negotiations, harder than standing in a field of dead after the Greymere campaign and making herself count faces instead of looking away, because this she had not been trained for. All the training she had received, all the political education, the diplomatic conditioning, the Alpha Court survival instincts, had been built on the assumption that she was standing beside someone, that there was a hand at her back, even when unseen. That hand was gone. She felt its absence the way you feel an amputation, not immediately, not all at once, but in the reaching. In the moment when instinct said turn, lean, share this look, and found nothing there. After the banquet's formal portion concluded and the hall dissolved into small gatherings and the free movement of post-dinner politics, Selene rose from her chair, excused herself from a conversation she hadn't been fully present in, and walked through a side door into the servants' corridor that ran parallel to the hall's east wall. She needed 30 seconds, just 30 seconds away from the watching. She got 12. Lady Ravenwood. She turned. General Harwick had followed her, which surprised her. Harwick was 60 years old, veteran of every major campaign the Ashbourne dynasty had fought in 20 years, a man she respected and who she believed respected her. He stood in the narrow corridor in his formal uniform, and he looked, for a man of his composure, deeply uncomfortable. "General," she said. "You need to know what I know," he said. "And I'm going to tell you because I served this empire before Riker Ashbourne sat on that throne, and I will serve it after, and what I know concerns the empire." "Then tell me." He glanced at the door they'd come through. Lady Thorne arrived in the capital 4 months ago. She came through the Eastern Territories from Lord Vane's estates. Selene kept her face still. She presented herself at court as a distant relative of the old Thornwood family. Minor nobility, nothing significant. But she had letters of introduction that Harwick stopped, chose his next words with the care of a man walking across ice. That bypassed the usual vetting. Riker admitted her to court personally. Inside 3 months, he was meeting with her privately. Inside 4, he had discontinued several of the briefings he had previously conducted with you. I noticed, Selene said. Yes. Harwick looked at her with something she identified after a moment as respect. I imagine you did. Lady Ravenwood, I don't know who Aurelia Thorne is. I don't know where she came from or what she wants, but I have been reading courts and their politics for 40 years, and I know when I'm watching someone move a piece on a board. And I know when a king is being moved without understanding, he's a piece. Selene was quiet for a moment. The child, she said. Harwick's expression confirmed everything. There are whispers, he said. I cannot confirm them, but there are whispers that the lady is with child, and that the king believes himself to be the father. The corridor was cold. The servants' passage wasn't heated, and the stone kept the chill from the outside in a way the main halls didn't. Selene was aware of this cold with sudden, specific clarity, the way the body sharpens its awareness of small physical sensations when the mind is processing something it cannot fully absorb. Thank you, General, she said. Her voice surprised her. It came out clean. What will you do? She looked at him. What I have always done. Manage what can be managed. Understand what needs understanding. She paused. And stop carrying the weight of a man who no longer wants it carried. Harwick held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. The short, definitive nod of a soldier conceding a point. Be careful, my lady. The woman knows what she's doing. So do I, Selene said. She meant it. She hadn't always meant it. There had been years, early years she kept in a locked section of memory, when she had not been certain of anything. When she had been 20 years old and newly arrived at Riker Ashbourne's war camp in the Northern Territory, sent there by her father, who had negotiated a political alliance that required the presence of a Ravenwood daughter at the future king's right hand. She had not been sent because of her power. She had been sent because she was available and because political daughters are a currency that powerful men trade without consulting the currency itself. She had arrived at that camp in the middle of a snowstorm, which she had taken, then, as a bad sign. Riker had met her at the entrance to the command tent without ceremony in his campaign gear, with mud on his boots and a tactical map in his hand, and his first words to her had been, "Can you read this?" He had held out the map. She had looked at it for 30 seconds, identified the tactical error in the defensive positioning of the northern flank, and pointed to it without speaking. He had looked at where she pointed, looked at her and said, "All right." That was the beginning. She had not loved him then. Love was not the operative word for whatever had existed between them in the years that followed. It was something older and more structural than love, something built from shared language and mutual reliance and the specific intimacy of two people who have seen each other at their worst in circumstances that mattered. The bond between an alpha and his Luna was part ancient instinct and part chosen commitment, and for Selene, both elements had arrived slowly, quietly, the way conviction arrives, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of moments, until you look up one day and realize the decision has already been made somewhere inside you. She had made her peace with that bond. She had, in 10 years, built something she was proud of. And Riker had looked at Aurelia Thorne across a banquet table tonight with the face he wore when he found relief. Selene walked back to her chambers through the main corridor, and she did not look at the black marble floor she had argued for, and she did not let herself feel anything about it, and she held herself together with the specific practiced discipline of a woman who had learned long ago that in this empire, in this court, grief was a weapon your enemies could use against you. She would grieve later. Tonight, she needed to think. Her chambers were in the West Wing, a suite of rooms she had slowly shaped over the years into a space that felt like herself. Shelves of maps and tactical records, a work table always occupied by whatever political problem she was currently untangling, a fireplace large enough to heat the room without theatrical excess. She dismissed her attendant, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room in her court gown. Then she sat down at her work table and began to think. The first thing she thought about was Harwick's description of Aurelia's arrival, the letters of introduction that bypassed vetting, the personal admission by Riker. That was the thread. An introduction that circumvented standard protocol meant someone with enough standing to authorize the bypass, which meant either a lord of significant influence or someone with access to Riker's personal trust. The Eastern Territories. Lord Vane's estates. Lord Vane, who had leaned toward his wife at the banquet and whispered something that made her smile. Lord Vane, whose estate taxes Selene had negotiated down 2 years ago in exchange for political cooperation that she had since noticed becoming increasingly selective. She wrote nothing down. She never wrote first thoughts, only conclusions. But she built the map inside her mind the way she built every strategic assessment. Start with what you know, identify what you don't, determine what the gap between them suggests. What she knew, Aurelia Thorne had appeared from the Eastern Territories with sponsored entry. She had, within 4 months, positioned herself as the king's primary emotional confidence. She had, apparently, convinced Riker he was the father of her child. And she had, in the space of a single banquet announcement, caused the political ground of the Moonfire Empire's court to shift. What she didn't know, who Aurelia Thorne actually was. What she actually wanted, whether the child existed. Who was behind her placement, because a woman that deliberate did not arrive at the capital of the most powerful Alpha Kingdom on the continent without architecture behind her. What the gap suggested, this was not a romance. This was a strategy. The fire burned down while she thought. The candles on her work table burned lower. The city outside grew quieter as the celebration wound through its hours toward the deep part of the night when even the most dedicated revelers found their way to beds. Selene sat at her table and mapped the situation she was in with the same methodical precision she had applied to border campaigns and succession crises and trade negotiations that hinged on 3 competing interests and 17 variables. She was good at this. It was, in truth, the thing she was best at. Not the grand gesture, not the charismatic moment, but the patient, accumulated intelligence of a mind that never stopped taking the world apart to see how it ran. She had spent 10 years applying this intelligence in service of Riker's throne. It occurred to her, sitting in that firelit room in the deepest part of the night, that she had never once applied it in service of herself. She had never needed to. She had been so entirely oriented toward his direction that her own direction had become a concept she had simply stopped thinking about. An alpha who loses himself in another's purpose does not merely give up ground. He gives up the map entirely. He wakes one day in a territory he does not recognize, defending walls he did not choose, fighting for a position that no longer belongs to his own life. This is not loyalty. Loyalty is a blade you carry by choice, knowing the weight of it. What Selene had been practicing in certain moments was closer to erasure, the slow, willing disappearance of a self into a larger shape. She was not yet angry. Anger was still some distance off, behind the wall of shock. But she was beginning, in that room, in the firelight, in the silence of a city that had spent the night celebrating a future she was no longer part of, to feel the first movements of something much older and much more dangerous than anger. The recognition of her own outline, the shape of herself without the surrounding context of his gravity. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt it, and she did not look away from it. 3 days later, the court had reorganized itself around the new reality with the efficiency of organisms adapting to environmental change. The Moonfire Court was, if nothing else, a masterclass in political survival. Nobody who had thrived in it had survived by being slow to read the direction of power. And the direction of power, clearly, had shifted. Selene noticed this in the way she always noticed important things, through accumulation of small details rather than any dramatic signal. The council meeting from which she was excluded happened on the second morning after the banquet. She arrived at the council chamber at the standard time, and the door was already closed. The steward outside informed her with an expression of studied neutrality that the meeting had been moved to an earlier hour and that her presence had not been specifically requested. She looked at the door for a moment, heard voices inside, Riker's among them, and quieter, a woman's voice offering something that drew a low sound of consideration from the king. She walked away. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she went to the armory. Not for weapons. She went because the armory's west section housed the tactical archives, the record of every campaign, border negotiation, and military decision made during Riker's reign. She had contributed to perhaps 60% of these records, either as primary strategist or advisory voice. She needed to look at something specific. She was looking at the northern border situation, a set of old intelligence reports about a territory beyond the Varick Mountains, the high range that separated the Moonfire Empire's northern edge from whatever lay beyond it. The reports were old, fragmentary, inconsistent. They spoke of settlements, of an old order of wolves who had retreated from the continent's political landscape generations ago, of a bloodline claim tied to terrain that no current empire had ever formally mapped. She had glanced at these reports before years ago and filed them as irrelevant. They described a situation too distant from the empire's current interests to prioritize. She was reconsidering what counted as relevant. What she was looking for, specifically, precisely, was a notation that appeared in the third report compiled by a border scout 20 years before Riker's reign. It described an encounter with a settlement elder who had made a claim that the scout had recorded with obvious skepticism. The elder had said that the Northern Territory recognized the sovereignty claim of only one bloodline, that the bloodline was identifiable by specific markings that manifested under conditions of extreme crisis or imminent threat, that the last known carrier of this bloodline had moved south into the continent's political sphere several generations ago, and had, the scout's notation ended here with a brief dismissal and a reference to old superstition. Selene had her own blood. She had always had her blood. The Ravenwood line was old, older than the Ashbourne dynasty, older than most of the Empire's current noble families. It had never been politically significant in any way she had been taught to consider significant. Her father had traded her as a political instrument precisely because the Ravenwood name, while historically notable, carried no current power. It was a name of faded nobility, impressive in genealogical records, irrelevant in councils. She stood in the armory with the old scout report in her hands and read the notation again. Then she rolled the record carefully, tucked it under her arm, and walked back to her chambers with her face arranged in the expression of a woman attending to administrative business. She had never manifested anything unusual, not in 10 years of crisis, of war, of personal and political pressure that would have broken less disciplined people. She had no particular reason to believe she was anything other than what she appeared. But she had also, in 10 years, never had nothing left to lose. And she was beginning to understand that everything she had built, everything she had shaped and maintained and protected, had been built with her hands on Riker's foundation. His throne, his empire, his dream. Not hers. She had no foundation of her own. That was not a complaint. That was a map. And a map, even one that shows you an abyss, is more useful than no map at all. On the 5th day after the banquet, she encountered Aurelia Thorne for the first time without the buffer of a full court around them. It was in the garden corridor, a glass-walled passage that connected the palace's south wing to the winter garden, filled with cultivated plants that the palace's head botanist maintained with a dedication that Selene had always privately admired. It was early morning, before most of the court was active, and Selene walked there sometimes because the light was cleaner than anywhere else in the palace. Aurelia was coming from the opposite direction. They stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Selene looked at the woman, really looked, without the distraction of a crowded room and a shattering announcement, and saw more clearly what she had partially assembled in those 4 seconds at the banquet. The precision of presentation, the awareness of being observed, and underneath it something she hadn't caught before. Intelligence. Not the political kind, though that too. Something sharper. The intelligence of a person who has spent considerable time studying other people and has gotten very good at using what they learn. Lady Ravenwood, Aurelia said. Her voice was warm in a way that was very slightly too warm, a fraction past genuine into calibrated. Lady Thorne, Selene said. I want you to know, Aurelia said, that I hold no resentment toward you. Your position was significant. I hope this transition has not been too difficult. She said significant the way you say it when you mean to suggest it was more than that, while appearing generous. Selene looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Let me be clear, Selene said, not because I owe it to you, but because I prefer honesty to theater. I don't believe you arrived here by accident. I don't believe your pregnancy, if there is one, is what you've represented it to be. And I don't believe Riker Ashbourne is capable of being manipulated by simply a pretty face and a warm manner, which means you have resources behind you that I intend to understand. She paused. I am saying this to you directly, so you know I am not caught. Whatever you believe you have achieved in the last 4 months, add this to your calculation. I'm paying attention now. Aurelia's face did not change, which was, in itself, telling, because most faces changed at that. You're in pain, Aurelia said. I understand. I'm sorry for it. No, Selene said simply. You're not. She walked past. She felt Aurelia's gaze on her back all the way to the garden door, and she did not turn around. And she kept her breathing even, and she counted her steps. And somewhere around step 14, she became aware of something she had not been aware of before in her life. Something in her blood. Not heat, not fever, not emotion. Something more cellular than that. Something beneath the skin, like a signal long dormant recognizing a frequency it had been designed for. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was gone before she could articulate it. She stopped at the garden door and pressed one hand flat against the glass and looked at the winter plants beyond. The cold-adapted things that survived without warmth because they had learned the shape of their own endurance. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back inside. She had work to do. She didn't yet know what kind, but she had always been best when she was figuring it out. The note arrived on the 7th day. It came through a channel she hadn't used in years, a back routing through the palace's supply correspondence, which meant whoever sent it knew the palace's internal architecture well enough to identify a communication pathway that didn't pass through the king's administrative staff. The note itself was brief, written in a hand she didn't recognize on plain paper with no seal. It read, "The old name does not sleep. When you are ready to hear what you carry, come north to the Varick Pass. Ask for the one who knows the mark. No signature." She read it twice, burned it, went to her window and looked north. The Varick Mountains were visible on clear days from the palace's upper floors, a dark line against the sky, always snow-capped, always present in the way that things that predate everything else in a landscape are present. They had always been simply a geographic boundary to her, the edge of the empire, the line beyond which the empire had never extended its reach. She looked at those mountains for a long time. Then, behind her, she heard the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside her chambers. Not raised in argument, raised in the specific way of court announcements, of news being carried rapidly from person to person. She opened her door. A page was running past. "What is it?" she asked. The page stopped, skidded slightly on the marble, turned to her with wide eyes. He was young, perhaps 15, and his face had the particular expression of someone who has just been part of something that will be talked about for a long time. "My lady," he said, "the king has just come from Lady Thorne's chambers. He's announced—" The boy swallowed. "He's announced that he will be formalizing Lady Thorne's position at court, officially, with a public document. She's to be given the title of—" He stopped. "Say it," Selene said. "Royal companion," the page said, "by decree, with all corresponding rights and access." He looked at her with the helpless empathy of a young person who understands that he is delivering something terrible. "I'm sorry, my lady." Selene looked at him. The moonstone ring on her right hand, the ring Riker had given her in the 3rd year of his reign, a quiet night in the war camp. Not a ceremony, not a formal occasion, just two people who had survived something together and needed the other to know it. Caught the corridor light and threw a small white point of brightness against the wall. "Thank you," she said. She went back inside. She closed the door. She stood in the center of her room and felt the signal in her blood come back, stronger this time. Not 4 seconds, but longer, a held note, a frequency finding its range. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Varick Mountains, something very old and very awake turned its attention south, toward her. Started. The decree would be posted by midday. By nightfall, Selene Ravenwood would begin the conversation she had been avoiding with herself for 10 years. And by the time the first snow fell on the Moonfire capital, the woman who had spent a decade building someone else's throne would make her first move toward the one that had always, without her knowing, been waiting for her. But first, she would have to walk into Riker's study. She would have to stand in front of the man who had just made her invisible. And she would have to ask him, face to face, with 10 years of shared history between them, whether any of it had meant what she'd believed it did. She didn't know what answer she was more afraid of. Yes or no. She knocked once, not because she needed permission. She had walked into Riker Ashbourne's study without knocking for 8 of the 10 years she had stood beside him, and the habit of entry had been built from proximity and mutual understanding that some spaces between two people stopped having formal boundaries after long enough. But today, she knocked. One hard knock, knuckle on iron-banded oak, because today the boundary existed again and she intended to acknowledge it on her own terms, rather than have it imposed on her. Come. She opened the door. The study was the one room in Ashbourne Palace that looked exactly like the man who used it. Not the throne room, which was built for intimidation and architectural grandeur, and not the War Council chamber, which was functional to the point of austerity. The study was where Riker actually worked, and it showed in the way lived-in spaces always show. The stacks of territorial reports on the left table, the tactical maps pinned to the wall with their corners curling from repeated rolling and unrolling, the single window left uncurtained regardless of the hour, because he had once told her he thought better with sky in his peripheral vision. Ink stains on the desk's left edge from 15 years of left-handed note-taking. A chair by the fire that was slightly misaligned from where it should be, dragged over and never returned to its original position, because he read there in the late hours and the fire needed to be closer. She had known all of this for years. Today it felt like reading the room of a stranger. Riker was standing at the wall map. He turned when she entered, and for a moment neither of them moved. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been waiting for this and had not found a way to prepare for it adequately regardless. His jaw was set. The scar along its edge caught the firelight. He was still in his formal shirt from the morning's announcement, collar loosened, the small evidence of a day that had been longer than its hours suggested. "Selene," he said. "Sit down," she said. He blinked. It was the response of a man who had not expected to be directed in his own space, and the reflex of authority almost surfaced. She saw it in the fractional straightening of his posture. Then something else replaced it. He pulled the chair from behind his desk and sat. She remained standing, not a power move, or not only that. She needed the ability to move if the conversation required it, and she already knew this conversation was going to require things she couldn't predict. "Tell me the truth," she said, "not the version for the court. Not the version that manages the political situation. The actual truth." He held her gaze. "What specifically are you asking? Is the child yours?" The fire crackled. Outside, somewhere in the palace's lower corridors, she could hear the distant sound of the decree being posted. The faint echoes of movement, of the machinery of royal announcement in motion. "I believe so," Riker said. Selene absorbed this. There was a thing that happened to the body when it received information it had already suspected but not confirmed. A settling, almost, like ground shifting to accommodate weight it knew was coming. She had suspected. The suspicion hadn't protected her. The confirmation landed anyway with its full mass. "You believe so," she repeated. "Or you know so." Aurelia has no reason to lie to me about this. Every person in a position of strategic advantage has a reason to control the information that maintains that position. She kept her voice level. "Riker, you know this. You have known this since before you sat on that throne. It is the first principle of every intelligence briefing you have ever received. This is different. Why?" He looked away, to the window, to the sky beyond it, to whatever answer existed out there that he hadn't been able to locate inside the room. "Because I was present. I know what happened between us." The words hit her differently than she expected. Not as a blow. She had steeled herself for blows, but as something more disorienting. Because embedded in those words was an admission that she had not braced for, confirmation that something had happened between them. Not insinuation, not political arrangement, something personal, something chosen, something that had occurred while Selene had been standing 6 feet away in the same palace, building the same empire, sleeping in the same wing. She needed a moment. She did not take the moment visibly. "How long?" she said. Riker turned back from the window. The set of his face told her he had known this question was arriving and had not found a way to deflect it that he could live with. 7 months, he said. 7 months. 7 months ago, Selene had been in the Western Territories for 6 weeks managing a succession dispute in a border lordship that, if mishandled, would have destabilized 2 trade agreements and triggered a military response from their southern neighbor. She had gone because Riker asked her to go, because she was the only person in his court who could manage the competing interests without either capitulating or escalating. She had done it. She had returned having secured both agreements and neutralized the succession dispute through a settlement that the Western lords still discussed as a model of political finesse. She had returned to a palace that, she now understood, had changed while she was away. "I see," she said. "Selene, I'm not finished. She moved, not toward him, but to the window, because she needed the sky too, and she was willing to admit that to herself. She looked out at Veltharion's morning, at the city that bore the results of 10 years of shared governance, at the streets and bridges, and the distant river, and all of it carrying forward without awareness of what was dissolving in this room. I went west because you needed the Western situation resolved. I resolved it. I came back. And in the time I was away, she stopped, recalculated, because she was about to say something that came from the raw place, the hurt place, and she had not come here for that. She had come here for information. What was it about her that I wasn't providing? Silence. This was the question that cost her to ask. She knew it when she heard herself say it, the vulnerability of it, the specific exposure of a woman asking a man to itemize her failures, to hand her the list of the things she had not been. She had not intended to ask this question. It had come from somewhere below the strategic layer, from the part of her that was not a political mind or a survival instinct, but simply a person who had loved someone for a long time and needed to understand what that had been worth. Riker was quiet for long enough that she turned from the window to look at him. He was looking at his hands. This was new. In 10 years, she had never seen Riker Ashbourne look at his hands. He looked at maps, at faces, at the horizon when he was calculating something he hadn't finished yet, not at his hands. It wasn't about what you weren't providing, he said. Then tell me what it was about. He stopped, started again. Aurelia doesn't look at me the way you do. Selene frowned. That's not an explanation. The way you look at me, he said, is the way someone looks at a project they're managing. Like you're always 3 steps ahead of whatever I'm about to do, calculating what it means, what needs to be done about it, how to handle it. He finally looked up. I know what you're going to say. That this is what you were supposed to do. That it's what the role required. I know that. But after a decade of being looked at like a variable in someone else's equation. Your equation, she said. The level quality of her voice cracked slightly on this, just slightly. It was your kingdom, your war, your throne. I was calculating how to protect what was yours. I know. And you found it suffocating. The word landed between them. This was the thing about long intimacy. It generated a specific kind of cruelty that strangers couldn't reach. You only knew where to put the knife if you'd had access to the body long enough to learn where it was soft. Not suffocating, he said. I never said you didn't have to. She moved away from the window, back toward the center of the room, because the distance between them was beginning to feel like a physical representation of something she didn't want to acknowledge. Riker, I need you to hear me clearly, because I am going to say this once and I am not going to repeat it. She stopped when she was close enough to see his eyes clearly. I was your Luna. I was your political mind, your strategic partner, your counsel in every crisis this empire survived. And I looked at you the way I looked at you because I took your life seriously, because the stakes were real, because if I had been soft about it, if I had looked at you the way you apparently wanted to be looked at, like you were uncomplicated, like you were simple, like there was no weight to what you were carrying, the kingdom would have suffered, and you would have made 3 additional catastrophic errors in the border campaigns alone, 2 of which I can cite specifically by date. He said nothing. I was not managing you, she said. I was holding the edge of something massive so you could stand in the center of it without being pulled apart. That is not calculation. That is the work nobody sees because the crises they prevent are invisible. I know, Riker said. You don't, she said, because if you knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Now here was a thing about powerful men, about the specific architecture of an alpha's psychology that Selene had spent 10 years studying from the inside. The relationship between strength and vulnerability in a dominant male was not the simple inverse that most people assumed. They did not fear weakness because they lacked it. They feared it because they had it, deeply and specifically, and the management of that fear was the primary invisible labor of any alpha's existence. Every act of dominance, every display of certainty, every refusal to bend, these were not the absence of vulnerability. They were its management. Riker Ashbourne was one of the most capable men Selene had ever encountered. And he was also, beneath the capacity, a person who had spent 34 years carrying an identity, king, alpha, heir, leader, that left no clean space for the simple human need to be understood without context, without agenda, without the weight of what understanding him might cost. Aurelia Thorne had apparently offered him that space, and he had walked into it without checking whether the floor was real. This was not stupidity, this was starvation. A starving person does not inspect the meal. "I'm not going to beg," Selene said. Her voice was even again. The crack had closed. "I came here because I needed to look at you while you told me the truth, so I would know what I was actually working with instead of what I imagined. I have what I needed." She turned toward the door. "Selene, wait." She stopped, did not turn. "I made a mistake," he said. "Which one?" she said. Not a question. "I should have told you, before the banquet, before the announcement. I should have—" "You deserve to hear it from me, privately." She turned her head enough to see his profile, the scar, the held tension in his shoulder. "Yes," she said. "I did. I'm sorry for that." She held this for a moment, tested its weight. "I know you are," she said. "But Riker, a man who is sorry for the delivery is not necessarily sorry for the decision." She opened the door. "Figure out which one you are." She left. The corridor outside the study was empty, which she was grateful for. She walked it slowly, not because she was weak. She refused to be weak in any hallway of this palace, but because the conversation had taken something from her that she needed to account for. Not energy, clarity. She had gone in knowing certain things, and had come out knowing different things, which was not the same as knowing more, and the shift required recalibration. 7 months. The Western Territories. He had been starving for something, and he had found it in a woman whose arrival had been arranged through a lord with whom Selene had, in retrospect, perhaps negotiated too efficiently. Lord Vane, whose estate taxes she had cut in exchange for political cooperation, he had subsequently delivered selectively. Selectively, she now understood, in the direction of Aurelia Thorne's access to the capital and the court. The picture was not yet complete, but it was developing. She went to her chambers. She changed out of the court dress into something she could move in. A practical dark wool, boots with real soles, hair down from its formal arrangement because formal arrangements were for rooms where she was performing a role, and she had just finished performing that role for the last time. She sat at her work table and pulled out the map she had brought from the armory 3 days prior. The northern route, the Varick Pass, the note she had burned. She was not going north today. She was not going anywhere today. Today she was going to sit in this room and build the rest of the picture she had started assembling, because incomplete pictures were how people made fatal errors, and she had come too far and paid too much to make a fatal error now. The knock at her door came in the early afternoon. Not a servant's knock. Servants knocked differently, a tentative thing, aware of its own intrusion. This was a direct, confident knock. 2 beats. She opened the door. The woman on the other side was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in traveling clothes with road dust still on the hem, dark-haired going silver, with the sort of face that had settled into its lines without apology and wore them like a record of everything it had survived. She was nobody Selene recognized, but she wore a mark on the back of her left hand, a pattern that Selene had seen described in the scout's notation from the Varick border report. Not a tattoo, a birthmark, faint, the color of old silver, shaped like overlapping crescents. Selene looked at the mark, looked at the woman's face. "You burned the note," the woman said. "Good. Means you understood who might be reading your correspondence." "Who are you?" Selene said. "Someone who's been waiting a long time for you to have a reason to listen." The woman's eyes moved past Selene into the room, assessing it with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to evaluating spaces for threats. "May I come in, my lady? What I have to say isn't for corridors." Selene stood back from the door. The woman entered. She went directly to the work table, looked at the map, at the armory report, and something in her expression shifted, something that looked unexpectedly like relief. "You already found it," the woman said. "I found a Border Scout's notation about an old territorial claim and a bloodline marker," Selene said. "I found it because I was looking for something to understand. I haven't found what I'm looking for yet." No." The woman turned from the table. "But you're about to." She looked at Selene with the directness of someone who has rehearsed a version of this moment for years and finds, now that it has arrived, that the rehearsed version is insufficient. Your mother was not from the Southern Territories. You were told she was. Your father told you she was because it was the version that made his political trading of you possible. If you had known what bloodline you carried, the trade would not have been his to make. The room was very quiet. My mother died when I was 3, Selene said. Your mother, the woman said, was Alara Varric, the last-born daughter of the Northern Moon Line, the line that goes back before this empire, before the Ashbourne dynasty, before any of the political architecture currently occupying this continent. The line that has a sovereign claim to the territory beyond the mountains that no current power has ever formally contested, because no current power knew the claim still existed in a living person. She paused. Until now. Selene sat down. Not from weakness. From the need to give her mind the stillness it required to process what it was receiving without filtering it through the immediate defensive instinct to disbelieve. Prove it, she said. The woman held out her left hand, the silver mark. Then she reached into her traveling coat and withdrew a small case, worn leather, the clasp tarnished with age. She set it on the work table. Open it. Selene opened it. Inside, on a lining of dark velvet, lay a ring. Not ornate, the opposite of ornate, in fact. Plain silver, heavy, with a single setting that held a stone the color of the sky at the precise moment before dawn, that particular shade between dark and light that has no clean name. The stone had a mark inside it. Not carved, not applied, but structural, part of the stone itself, the same overlapping crescent pattern worn on the woman's hand. Selene looked at it without touching it. What happens when I put it on? She said. I don't know exactly, the woman said, with honesty that Selene found more convincing than any confident answer would have been. The last person to wear it was your mother. What I know is that the bloodline responds to recognition. You've been carrying something dormant your entire life. The conditions haven't been right to wake it, until recently. Because I have nothing left to lose, Selene said. Because you stopped belonging to someone else's purpose, the woman said. Loss is part of it, but it's not the loss that does it. It's the clearing, the space that opens when you stop filling your life with someone else's shape. Selene was silent. She thought about the signal in her blood. 4 seconds in the garden corridor, Aurelia's controlled smile, the winter plants beyond the glass. Then longer, in her chambers, after the page brought news of the decree. She thought about 10 years of applying everything she had in a direction that was not her own. She thought about Riker's hands, the way he had looked at them, the particular devastation of a man who knows he has done something he cannot undo and is only beginning to understand the scale of it. She picked up the ring. It was heavier than it looked. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the cool of old silver, the specific gravity of something that had waited longer than she had been alive. And she thought clearly, without romanticism and without panic, about the choice she was making. Not about what it meant for the future. The future was too unmapped to assess yet, but about what it meant right now, in this room, on this afternoon, in the 7th day of the life she was apparently beginning. She put it on. Nothing theatrical happened. No light, no sound, no visible change in the room, but the signal in her blood, the signal she had felt for seconds at a time and then lost, stopped being intermittent. It became continuous. A frequency, held clear, the way a bell sounds after it's been rung when you're close enough to feel it in your teeth. She felt it in her spine, in the back of her jaw, in the soles of her feet through her boots on the cold floor. Not pain, not exactly warmth, something more fundamental than both. Like a part of her that had been switched off for her entire life had just been switched on, and the system was running a check of everything it found. She gripped the edge of the work table. The woman watched her without speaking. How long does this last? Selene managed. It doesn't stop, the woman said. You adjust to it. Selene breathed. In, out. The frequency settled. Didn't diminish, but found its place, stopped being something she was bracing against, and became something she was simply standing in. Who are you? She asked again. My name is Vara, the woman said. I was your mother's attendant. I've been in the North since you were 4 years old, the year after your father sold the story of your lineage to himself and anyone who asked. I've been waiting. She said the last two words without bitterness, with the flat factuality of someone for whom patience had long since become indistinguishable from purpose. The northern houses know the bloodline survives. They've known for 20 years. They've been waiting for the carrier to be in a position to receive it. And now I'm in a position to receive it because I've been publicly discarded by the king I helped build, Selene said. You're in a position to receive it because you finally stopped looking at yourself through his eyes, Vera said. The discarding was his choice. The arrival is yours. This was the distinction, the one that separated the two possible versions of whatever was beginning in this room. The version where Selene was a wounded woman who had found a convenient alternative to grief, and the version where she was someone who had been on the wrong foundation for a decade and had just found solid ground. She could not be certain which version was true. What she was certain of was the frequency in her blood. That was not grief. That was not wound. That was structure. Something load-bearing and very old that had existed in her body long before Riker Ashbourne, long before the Moonfire Empire, long before any of the architecture of the current world. She had been real before she was his Luna. She had simply not known how real. She looked at Vera. What do the northern houses need from me? Not need, Vara said. Offer. There's a difference. She settled into the chair across the work table with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time on hard surfaces and had made peace with all of them. The Northern Moon Dominion has been without a sovereign claim for 26 years, since your mother went south and never came back. In that time, the houses have maintained their own governance. They're not a broken people. Not a desperate one, but a bloodline claim activated, recognized, wielded by a living heir who is also... She looked at Selene with the same assessing quality Selene recognized from her own mirror. Who is also what you are, strategically formed, politically educated, battle-seasoned. That's not a rescue, that's a match. You're describing a sovereignty bid, Selene said. I'm describing a reality that exists whether you bid for it or not, Vera said. The Dominion exists. The claim exists. The only question is whether you engage with it as a principle or spend the rest of your life standing outside it as someone who could have. Outside the window, the first snow of the season began to fall on Veltharion. Selene watched it. Thin, early snow, more suggestion than substance. The kind that didn't stick on the first pass but meant the real thing was coming. The kind of change that announced itself quietly before it became undeniable. She had lived in this palace for 10 years. She had built this city's political architecture from the inside. And the man she had done it for had, this morning, signed a decree naming another woman his royal companion. The moonstone ring on her right hand caught the gray light through the window. Riker's ring. The one from the third year of his reign. The quiet night, the war camp. The moment that had felt like something chosen rather than arranged. She looked at it. She thought about what General Harwick had said. A piece on a board that doesn't know it's being moved. She thought about what Riker had said. She doesn't look at me the way you do. She thought about what she had said to Aurelia in the garden corridor. I'm paying attention now. She turned from the window. Tell me about the northern houses, she said to Vera. Tell me who holds what territory, what the internal political situation is, what they'll require from a sovereignty claim to recognize it as legitimate. Tell me about the pass, and what the travel timeline looks like in winter, and what kind of force or presence would be expected for a first contact that establishes authority without triggering defensiveness. She pulled the tactical map from under the armory report and spread it on the table. Start from what you know. Vara looked at the map, looked at Selene, and something in the old woman's face, the face that had been patient for 26 years, that had carried a leather case and an old ring across frozen roads to a palace in a city that belonged to another woman's son, finally, quietly, let itself go. She leaned forward and began. They talked through the afternoon, through the early dark of winter's approach, through the sound of the palace shifting around them, of dinner being served in halls where Selene was no longer expected, of a court reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. When Vara finally rose to leave, the fire was low, and the snow outside had thickened. Come north when you're ready, Vera said. Not before. The houses will wait. But don't wait too long, Trej. Spring changes the pass, and what can be traveled in winter becomes contested in the thaw. I'll be ready before spring, Selene said. Vera looked at her with the ring on her hand and the map on the table and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have finally found the correct direction. "Yes," Vera said. "I think you will." She left. Selene sat alone. The frequency in her blood ran on. And then, through the wall, through the stone, through 2 corridors and a formal receiving chamber, she heard the sound of raised voices. One of them was Riker's, which was identifiable at any volume. The other was female, not Aurelia. The voice was too old for Aurelia, and the tone was different, not the warmth-calibrated smoothness of the royal companion. This voice was clipped, precise, carrying the particular accent of someone who had received the same training in controlled speech that Selene had and had applied it differently, in a sharper direction. Selene stood. She crossed to her door and opened it and walked toward the sound, not running, not urgent, just purposeful, because purposeful was now the only mode she had available to herself. She turned a corner and stopped. In the receiving chamber at the end of the corridor, visible through the half-open door, Riker stood with his back to her. Across from him stood a woman Selene recognized, Lady Marin of House Castor, one of the Eastern Territory's most powerful noble families, political ally to several of the Empire's critical trade agreements, a woman who had been, in Selene's assessment, the steadiest of the court's independent power bases. Lady Marin was holding a document. Her face was the color of cold fury. "This decree," Lady Marin said, "is not a private matter, Your Majesty. What you do in your personal life is your affair. What you do by royal decree is this court's affair. And this decree changes the political calculus of every arrangement that was made contingent on a specific future for this empire." "Lady Marin, I aligned House Castor's trade agreements with the Moonfire Empire based on assurances of stability, based on the expectation of a Luna who had demonstrated, in 17 years of this court's operation, competence, intelligence, and the kind of institutional knowledge that does not transfer. You have not simply delayed a ceremony. You have removed the political architecture from underneath agreements that 3 houses depend upon." She set the document on the nearest table. "My house will be reviewing its commitments." Riker's voice was even. "That would be a considerable error in judgment, my lady." "Perhaps," Marin said. "I've made them before. I survived them." She turned to leave and stopped when she saw Selene in the corridor. The 2 women looked at each other. Marin's expression shifted. Not to pity, to something more complicated, the look of a person recalculating based on new information. "Lady Ravenwood," she said. "Lady Marin," Selene said. A beat of silence. "I hope," Marin said carefully, "that you are well." "I am," Selene said, "and I hope House Castor's review of its commitments is thorough." She held the older woman's gaze. Thoroughness is its own protection. Something passed between them. Not an agreement, too early, too unspecified, too much left unsaid, but the acknowledgement of a frequency. 2 intelligent people recognizing each other across a changed landscape, each noting where the other is standing. Marin inclined her head, walked past. Selene looked at Riker. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen before on him. Not carefully braced, not managing. Something rawer than either of those things. Something that looked uncomfortably like the beginning of understanding arriving too late. "She won't be the last," Selene said. "Selene, she won't be the last lord or general who comes to you with that document in their hand and that expression on their face. Because what you did this morning with that decree was not simply personal. It was political. And every person in this empire who structured anything around the assumption of a stable succession just had the ground moved under them." She looked at him across the receiving chamber, across the cold space of a relationship coming apart at every seam. "I would have managed that for you. I would have anticipated it and prevented half of it before the ink dried. I would have had conversations with Marin and 7 others before the decree was ever posted, and you would never have had to stand in this room looking the way you look right now." Gee, his jaw was tight. "I know," he said. "But I'm not going to," she said. "Not anymore. You chose something. Live in the consequences of it. That's what you always told me about every decision we made in this empire. The weight of the choice belongs to the person who made it." She turned to go. "What are you going to do?" he said. She stopped. She thought about Vara, about the ring on her hand, the frequency in her blood, the map on her work table, the northern pass in winter, 26 years of waiting that was about to end. She thought about who she was, not as Luna, not a political instrument, not the woman who had been looking at him the way you look at a project you're managing. Herself. "Something I should have done a long time ago," she said, and she walked out. Behind her, in the receiving chamber, Riker Ashbourne stood alone with a royal decree on a side table and the echo of a door closing and the specific silence of a room where something permanent had just shifted without announcement. In the corridor, Selene moved through the palace toward her chambers, through the black marble halls she had chosen, past the iron sconces she had approved, through the architecture of a kingdom she had spent 10 years making real. She walked through it like a woman taking inventory before departure. And on her right hand, where the moonstone ring had lived for 7 years, the ring Riker had given her in a war camp in the 3rd year of his reign, something new rested now. Heavier, older, the color of the sky between dark and light. She did not look back. The snow was falling harder outside, and somewhere in the northern reaches of the continent, beyond the Virak Pass, in a territory that no empire had ever fully mapped, the houses that had waited 26 years felt something they had not felt since before Selene Ravenwood had been born. They felt the bloodline come alive, and every alpha among them raised their head. The snow did not stop. It fell through the night and into the next morning with the specific determination of a northern storm that has traveled a long distance and intends to finish what it started. By dawn, Veltharian's streets were white to the knee, and the palace's outer courtyards had disappeared under a uniformity that made the world look like it had been wiped clean. From her window, Selene watched the city go about the business of surviving weather. The cart tracks, the salt crews on the bridge, the smoke rising from every chimney into a sky the color of old iron. She had not slept, not from agitation, from thinking, which for Selene had always been a more wakeful activity than most people's sleep. She had spent the night at her work table with Vara's account mapped against the armory reports and everything she knew about northern territorial politics, which was less than she knew about most things, and more than anyone in Riker's court knew about any of it, because nobody in Riker's court had ever considered the Northern Territory worth the intelligence investment. That oversight, she was now understanding, was not an accident. There is a particular quality to information that has been deliberately kept absent from a political landscape. Most gaps in institutional knowledge are the product of simple neglect, things nobody thought to study because they never seemed relevant, resources directed toward immediate concerns rather than theoretical ones. But some gaps are architectural, designed, the result of deliberate choices made early to ensure that certain lines of inquiry never developed into conclusions. Selene had been building a picture all night. By morning, the picture had edges. She was looking at those edges when the knock came. Not Vera's 2-beat knock. A single knock, hesitant. The knock of someone who was not certain of their welcome. She opened the door. The page from yesterday. The boy, perhaps 15, with the wide eyes and the helpless empathy, was standing in the corridor with snow still on his shoulders from wherever he had come from outside. "My lady," he said, "I'm sorry to come early. I have—" He glanced down the corridor in both directions, the quick surveillance of someone who has learned recently that corridors have ears. "I have something I took. I shouldn't have taken it, but I didn't know who else to bring it to." He held out a folded paper. Selene took it. She looked at him. "Where did you get this?" "The decree office," he said. "Last night, late. I was there because I forgot my— It doesn't matter why I was there. What matters is I saw Lady Thorne's attendant leaving, and she left this on the floor by the document table, and I don't think she meant to leave it, but I picked it up before anyone else could see it, and I read it, and I—" He stopped. His voice had developed a slight unsteadiness that he was trying to control. "I didn't know who else, my lady." Selene unfolded the paper. It was a letter. Not long. Half a page. In a hand that was careful and practiced. The hand of someone writing in a script they'd been trained in rather than one that had developed naturally from use. The kind of uniformity that belonged to formal correspondence education. The salutation was absent. The letter began in the middle of a thought, which meant this was not the beginning of the communication, but a continuation of one. She read it once, fast. Then she read it again slowly because the first reading had not been sufficient for what the letter contained. The letter was addressed to a name she did not immediately recognize, Lord Edric Vane, not Lord Cassius Vane, which meant a relative, a brother or a cousin, not the lord she had dealt with directly. And it was from Aurelia, not from the warm, calibrated woman of the garden corridor, from whoever existed underneath that. The letter discussed, in the clipped and specific language of strategic correspondence, a timeline. The child, referred to as the asset, a word that lodged in Selene's chest like a splinter, was viable and the claim was holding. The king remained convinced. The mating bond disruption had been successfully engineered, as anticipated, through the extended separation period and the sustained confidence-building work of the prior 4 months. 2 additional houses had been identified for realignment, contingent on the Luna's continued removal from political influence. The northern problem had been assessed as manageable. The northern problem. Selene stood very still. She read that phrase 3 times. The northern problem, Aurelia had written, has been identified and a solution is in motion. The bloodline situation will be contained before it becomes a complicating factor. Timing is essential. The asset must be secured on the throne before the heir is recognized by the northern houses. Once the heir has a crown, the claim is uncontestable. The heir. Selene. They knew. She folded the letter carefully, with the deliberate precision of someone managing the distance between their hands and what they are feeling. She looked at the page. "You did the right thing," she said. Her voice was level. "Go back to your duties. Say nothing to anyone about this. Not the letter, not bringing it to me, nothing." "Yes, my lady." He hesitated. "Are you—" "Go," she said, not unkindly, but with the specific finality that closes a door. He went. She closed her own door and stood in the center of her room and let herself feel what the letter meant for exactly 30 seconds. Then she put the feeling away and began to move. Because here was the thing about betrayal at this scale, and Selene had studied enough of it from the outside to understand its mechanics. Betrayal of this architecture, the kind that had been planned over months and executed through carefully placed proximity, was not primarily an emotional event. It was a logistical one. The emotional dimension was real, and it would demand its accounting eventually. But the immediate reality was a set of operational facts that needed to be responded to before they became irreversible. The facts were these. Aurelia Thorne knew about the Northern bloodline claim. She had identified Selene as the heir. She had a timeline, and that timeline was contingent on securing the asset, the child, the supposed child, the claim to Riker's succession, before the Northern houses could formally recognize Selene, which meant someone in Aurelia's network had known about the bloodline before Vara came south, which meant the gap in Riker's intelligence about the Northern territory was not neglect. It was suppression. Someone had ensured the Moonfire Court never developed the intelligence capacity to understand what lay beyond the Varric Pass, because a king who understood what lay there would have had a very different conversation with Selene about her lineage a very long time ago. She pulled on her boots and her coat. She needed Harwick. She found him at the barracks, which was where he spent his mornings regardless of the weather and regardless of the political climate in the main palace, a habit of 40 years that had survived 2 dynasty changes and would likely survive a 3rd. He was reviewing a supply manifest when she came through the door, and he looked up at her face and set the manifest down without being asked. "My lady." She handed him the letter. He read it. His face did not change in any visible way, but she watched his hands, and after the second paragraph, his right hand went flat on the table, in the way hands do when the body is making itself brace. When he finished, he set it down. "House Vane," he said. "The Eastern branch," she said. "Not Cassius. Edric. A cousin, I think, or a brother. Someone with enough standing to receive correspondence of this sensitivity, but not enough to be in my intelligence picture." "Because your intelligence picture was curated," Harwick said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Harwick, the Northern problem. They know about the bloodline." "How?" "I don't know yet. That's the part that matters most, and the part I have the least information about." She pulled a chair from the wall and sat in it, because standing while thinking had stopped being productive, and she needed a different posture for what came next. "What I know is that there is a timeline and we are currently inside it. The letter suggests the containment solution is already in motion, which means whatever they intend to do about the northern claim, they have already begun doing it. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Vara, he said. The word hit. She had not gotten there yet. She had been moving so fast through the operational implications that she had not taken the next step. She took it now. Vara had come south through the Eastern Territories, through Lord Vane's region. Vara had known where to find Selene, had known which correspondence channel to use, had arrived with precisely timed information at precisely the moment it would be most effective. The frequency in her blood was still running. The ring was still on her hand. Those things were real. She was certain of their reality in a way that didn't depend on Vara's trustworthiness, because the bloodline was not something a woman from the Eastern Territories could manufacture in a leather case. But the timing. The specific and convenient timing of Vara's arrival. The letter's reference to the northern problem and a solution already in motion. A solution that might not mean eliminating the heir. A solution that might mean controlling her, directing her, making the bloodline available to a purpose other than the one the northern houses intended. She stood up. I need to go back to my chambers, she said. What do you need from me? Harwick said. Nothing yet. Keep this. She nodded toward the letter. Safe. Not in the palace's administrative records. Keep it on your person. She moved toward the door. And Harwick, if anything happens to me in the next 48 hours, anything at all, anything that looks like accident or illness or simply my absence, you take that letter to Lady Marin of House Castor. Harwick's face was the face of a soldier who has received an order he doesn't like and is going to follow it anyway. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. Probably not, she agreed. But probability is not certainty, and I stopped operating on probability this morning. She went back through the snow-changed palace. There are moments in a person's life when everything they understood about their situation reveals itself to have been a shallower reading than the situation required. Not necessarily a wrong reading. Sometimes the surface was an accurate description of the surface. But the surface was not the whole. Beneath the political drama of a king postponing a mating ceremony, beneath the visible story of a Luna being displaced by a younger woman, beneath even the larger conspiracy of a planted operative engineering a royal confidence, beneath all of that, a structure had existed for years that nobody in Riker's court had been equipped to see. Power, at its most sophisticated, does not announce its architecture. The deepest strategies are the ones that make their operating environment look like the natural state of things. Selene had understood this as a principle. She had not understood it as a description of her own life. She had been a Luna who never questioned why the Northern intelligence was sparse, who had accepted the briefings she was given without examining their edges for deliberate absence, who had been, for 10 years, extremely intelligent inside a frame that had been constructed to make certain conclusions unreachable. This is the ruthless lesson of institutional manipulation. The cage is most effective when it is built to look like the limits of the world. She arrived at her chambers. Vara was inside. The door was unlocked, which it should not have been, and Vara was at the work table with her back to the door looking at the map. She turned when Selene entered, and her face was the same, composed, patient, the face of a woman who had been waiting for a very long time. You read something this morning, Vara said. Not a question. Sit down, Selene said. My lady, sit down. The two words landed with a weight that was new. She had spoken with authority before, but that authority had always been borrowed from proximity to Riker's throne. This was different. This came from the frequency in her blood, from the ring on her hand, from the specific and total clarity of a woman who has stripped away every borrowed frame and found her own underneath. Vara sat. Selene placed herself between Vara and the door. Not a calculated move. Or not only that, also simply the correct position from which to have a conversation in which escape was a variable. Tell me how you traveled south, she said. Specifically, every stop, every contact, who knew you were coming and how far in advance they knew. Vara's face showed the first thing Selene had seen on it other than patience and relief. Calculation. It was brief, a flicker, the adjustment of a person deciding how much truth the moment required, but Selene had been reading faces in hostile rooms for 10 years, and she caught it with the same ease that she would have caught a blade thrown slowly. The eastern route was the safest pass in winter, Vera said. Through Lord Vane's territory, Selene said. A pause, slightly too long. I have contacts in the Eastern Territories, Vera said. People who knew Alara, who knew the bloodline situation. They helped arrange passage. And those contacts, Selene said, did they also know Aurelia Thorne? The room went still in the way rooms go still when a truth that has been concealed is suddenly in the air between two people, and both of them can feel it, and only one of them is surprised by it. Vera looked at her for a long moment, then she said, What do you know? Everything I need to, Selene said. The question is what you're going to tell me, and whether the version you tell me is the full truth or a managed version, and whether you understand that I can tell the difference. Vara closed her eyes. When she opened them, the patience was still there, but it had changed character. It was no longer the patience of someone waiting for a plan to develop. It was the patience of someone who has been holding something heavy for too long and is considering, finally, the possibility of setting it down. I am not your enemy, Vera said. I know, Selene said. If you were my enemy, you would have given me something false last night, and the ring would not have worked, and the frequency I have been living in for the last 14 hours would not exist. She kept her eyes on the old woman's face. But you are also not fully what you presented yourself to be. And right now I need to know the parts you left out. Vara looked at her hands. The Eastern contacts, she said slowly. Some of them are complicated in their allegiances. There are people in Lord Vane's network who knew about the bloodline and who had their own interest in whether it was activated. Not the same interest as the northern houses. A different one. Aurelia's interest, Selene said. Aurelia's patron's interest, Vera said. Aurelia is not the architect of this. She is extremely capable and she has her own ambition, but what she is running is larger than a personal play for a royal title. There are people behind her who want the northern claim controlled. Not eliminated. Controlled. A recognized heir under the right influence is more useful than no heir at all. And bringing me into contact with the bloodline, Selene said, could have served both purposes, Vera said. The northern houses get their heir. The other interest gets access to the heir. She paused. I want you to understand, I still believe, that the bloodline awakening is real and right, and yours. I did not bring you false information. Your mother was Alara Varric. The ring is real, the claim is real, but the channel through which I reached you, she stopped, was not as clean as it should have been. Selene looked at her for a long time. There is a specific experience of betrayal that is not the sharp, clean cut of a single act, but the slower, more complicated unraveling that comes from discovering that something true was delivered through impure hands. The ring was real, the bloodline was real, and the woman who had brought them had also been imprecisely aligned. Perhaps not deceived herself. Perhaps not entirely free to operate otherwise. The Eastern contacts. 40 years of isolation in a political landscape where survival required compromise. Selene understood compromise. She had made enough of it. Who is Aurelia's patron? She said. Vera shook her head. I don't know the name. I know the reach. Eastern territories, multiple houses, resources that don't match any visible noble family's wealth. Whatever it is, it's been building for a long time. Longer than Aurelia has been in Veltharion. Longer than Riker has been on the throne, Selene said slowly. Vera looked at her. And in the quality of that look, and what it did not deny, Selene found the worst edge of the picture she had been building all night. This was not about Riker making a bad personal choice. This was not about a manipulative woman finding a vulnerable king. This was about a strategy that had been in place before Riker sat on his throne, possibly before he took the Northern campaign that consolidated his power, possibly before he sent for a Ravenwood daughter from a family with a bloodline nobody had bothered to investigate, possibly before any of the architecture of the current world had taken its current shape. The Moonfire Empire had been built on a foundation that someone else had prepared, and Selene had spent 10 years maintaining that foundation without knowing whose hands had originally laid it. She walked to the window. The snow had stopped. The city was white and still under a sky that had spent itself overnight and now had nothing left. She thought about Riker in his study, his hands. She doesn't look at me the way you do. And underneath that, the man who had been maneuvered into a position of emotional vulnerability by someone who understood exactly which kind of hunger to feed, who had identified the specific gap between what Riker needed and what his Luna's constant competence could provide, and who had slid into that gap with surgical precision. He was not blameless. She would not make him blameless. His choices were his own, and the weight of them belonged to him. But he was also, she understood now, a man who had been as managed as she had been. Not the same way, not toward the same end, but managed nonetheless. The king and his Luna, both pieces on a board, moved in directions that served an architecture neither of them had been permitted to see. The difference was that Selene was seeing it now. The difference was that she had nothing left to lose, and a bloodline nobody had successfully contained yet, and a frequency running in her bones that had not existed 48 hours ago. She turned from the window. "The northern houses," she said. "If I travel to the Varick Pass, not through the eastern route, not through any contact veins network has visibility on, can the houses receive me in a way that cannot be intercepted or monitored by whatever is operating out of the east?" Vara considered this with genuine attention rather than calculated pause. "There is a western approach," she said. "Longer, more difficult in winter, but it bypasses the eastern territory entirely. I know the route. It would add 4 days to the travel." "Is it safe?" "Safer than the alternative," Vara said. "Nothing is fully safe." "No," Selene agreed. "Nothing is." She looked at the ring on her hand, the stone that held the crescent mark inside it, like a thing that had always been there, waiting for the light to find it. Then she looked at Vara with the full weight of what she had become in the last 14 hours. Not the woman who had walked into Riker's study, and not the woman who had walked out of it, but something past both of those. Something that had no shape yet but had mass, like a storm that has not declared its form but has already decided its direction. "You will tell me everything," Selene said. "Not the version that protects the eastern contacts, not the version that manages my reaction. Everything, the full architecture of what you know, who you spoke to, what was said and when, and in whose presence, and then I am going to decide what to do with it." "And if what I tell you changes how you feel about the bloodline," Vara said quietly. "The bloodline is mine," Selene said. "It doesn't become less mine because the woman who brought it to me had compromised contacts. The truth of what I carry doesn't depend on the purity of the channel it arrived through." She held Vara's gaze. "But I will not walk into that northern pass carrying incomplete intelligence. Not again. Not after 10 years of operating inside a frame I didn't know was built for me." Vara looked at her for a long moment. Then she began to talk. And Selene listened. Really listened, the way she had not listened in this palace for a long time, with every intelligence she had sharpened over 10 years pointed not at someone else's problem, but at her own. Outside, a bird crossed the white sky from east to west, and in the east wing of Ashbourne Palace, in chambers that had been prepared for Aurelia Thorne's occupation, a woman who was not who she had presented herself to be, read a letter from an attendant she had sent to retrieve something she had lost, and understood, from the attendant's description of what she had found in its place on the corridor floor, an absence where there should have been paper, that the letter was gone, and that someone had it. Her face did not change. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought for a long time. Then she called for her attendant again and gave instructions that were quiet, specific, and final. By nightfall, the trap had changed shape. It was no longer designed to control what Selene Ravenwood might become. It was designed to ensure she never reached the north at all. The trap came before dawn, not the kind that announces itself with noise and movement, but the quiet kind. The kind built by someone who understands that the most effective cage is the one the target walks into believing it is a door. Selene had spent 4 hours with Vara, extracting everything the old woman knew, building the full architecture of what operated behind Aurelia Thorne's careful face. By the time the fire in her chambers had burned to coals and the snow outside had gone from white to the blue-gray of deep winter pre-dawn, she had a picture complete enough to act on. She had been preparing to move. The knock at her door stopped her mid-step. 3 knocks. Hard. The knock of someone who needed entry immediately and was past the social concern of appearing urgent. She opened it. Harwick stood in full campaign gear, which told her everything before he said a word. A general did not put on campaign gear at 4 in the morning for a social concern. "They've moved on the pass," he said. She felt the words land in her chest like cold water. "When?" 2 hours ago. Eastern Cavalry, 40 riders, under Lord Edric Vane's direct command. They're riding for the Varick approach through the Sortheld Valley. It's the fastest winter route to the northern pass. If they reach the passage point before dawn, they can hold it for days with 40 riders. Nothing gets through. He looked at her face, then at the ring on her hand, then back at her face. They're not going to kill you, my lady. I don't think that's the intent. They're going to cut off the north. They're going to ensure I can't reach the northern houses before the houses give up waiting and go home, she said. Yes. She thought for exactly 4 seconds. How many men do you have that are yours, she said. Not the king's, yours. Men who will ride on your word without waiting for a royal order. Harwick did not hesitate. 12. Good ones. Is 12 enough to reach the pass before Vane's cavalry if we leave now? Not enough to fight 40, he said, but enough to get there first if we take the old mill road. It's rougher than the valley route, but it cuts 2 hours off the distance. Vane's men don't know it. It's not on any administrative map. It's a working road, been there since before the current survey. She was already moving, coat, boots, the leather satchel from under her work table that held the armory report, the letter, and 3 other documents she had assembled through the night. She looked at Vara, who had risen from her chair and was watching with the steady eyes of a woman who had not expected this to be easy. The western approach, Selene said to her. Can it be accessed from the Mill Road junction? 2 miles north of the junction, yes, Vara said. There's a split. The valley road continues east. The western approach breaks off through the high timber. You're riding with us, Selene said. It was not a question. I'm 61 years old, Vara said. I know how old you are. Can you ride? A pause. Yes? Then get your coat. They moved through the palace's lower levels with the practiced invisibility of people who understood that the palace's upper corridors were watched and its lower ones were not, because nobody with political interest had ever needed to move through the cold storage passages and the old service routes that connected the palace's working foundations. Harwick knew these routes better than anyone. 40 years left a man with a cartographic memory of wherever he had spent them. They reached the stable's eastern entrance without encountering anyone except 2 grooms who looked at Harwick's campaign gear and Selene's face and found immediate interest in the far wall. The horses were ready in 12 minutes, 12 riders, Harwick, Vara, and Selene. 15 total. Into the pre-dawn dark, on roads that were white and silent and untracked. They rode hard. There is something that happens to the mind when the body is in motion and the stakes are absolute, a particular quality of clarity that ordinary circumstance cannot produce. The cold hit hard, wind off the northern approach finding every gap in the wool and leather, and Selene rode into it with her eyes on the dark shapes of the road ahead and her mind running at a speed that had nothing to do with the horse under her. She was thinking about the letter, about the Eastern patron whose name Vara didn't know, but whose reach she had described. Multiple houses, resources exceeding visible noble family wealth, a timeline that predated Riker's reign. She was thinking about who built the frame, not Aurelia, not Lord Vane, either branch, Aurelia's patron, the architect behind the architecture, someone who had identified years before any of the current players were in position that the Moonfire Empire's consolidation under Riker Ashbourne would create a power center on the continent worth capturing, and who had identified equally early that the Northern Bloodline claim was the one existing legal structure capable of contesting that power center. Who controlled both was positioned to control everything. The Mill Road was rougher than the Valley route in the way that honest things are rougher than managed ones. Unmarked, ungraded, the ruts of actual working use rather than administrative maintenance. The horses knew hard ground, and they covered it. Harwick rode at the front. Vara rode in the middle with the focused expression of a woman who had made peace with discomfort a long time ago. Selene rode at Harwick's shoulder because she needed visibility, and she needed to be able to speak to him without raising her voice over the wind. When we reach the pass junction, she said, and Vane's cavalry is already there. Then we don't fight 40 with 15, Harwick said. We go west, the western approach. And the northern houses receive me without the formal passage recognition. Do they need the formal passage? I don't know, she said honestly. Vara pulled up alongside them, her horse's breath coming in visible clouds. The formal passage is traditional, not required, she said over the wind. The bloodline recognition doesn't depend on the route. It depends on the heir presenting at the first house's threshold with the ring and the mark. The passage point is a formality. One that Aurelia's patron wanted controlled, Selene said. Because the passage is public, Vera said. Every rider going through the Varic approach is visible from the valley settlements below. They wanted visibility on you, not just the block, the knowledge that you had been blocked. So they could tell the northern houses I chose not to come, Selene said. Vera was quiet, which was confirmation. The sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. Not sunrise yet, but the preliminary gray of a world becoming visible. Around them, the landscape had changed from the city's white flatness to the rougher terrain of the approach roads, snow-covered hills rising on the northern side, dark timber on the west. The air had the specific quality of altitude beginning. Thinner, sharper, the cold of it more structural than the city cold. They heard the cavalry before they saw it. Sound traveled differently in winter terrain, especially in the pre-dawn when human noise was absent and the landscape became a clean conductor. The sound was hooves on packed snow, a lot of them, coming from the southeast. The valley road. Harwick raised his fist. They stopped. He listened for 3 seconds. 40, maybe more, he said quietly. They're moving fast. They're going to reach the junction before us if we hold. We don't hold, Selene said. West, now. My lady, if they see us break for the western timber, they'll follow, she said. Yes, I know. She looked at him. Harwick, what I'm about to do requires your 12 men to be willing to do something difficult. He looked at her steadily. Tell me. Split. 8 ride with me and Vara into the western approach. 4 ride toward the junction. Visible, loud, making enough noise to suggest the full group. Not to engage. To draw attention long enough for us to reach the timberline. Harwick assessed this in the 2 seconds a man with 40 years of tactical experience needs to assess a split maneuver in winter terrain. If Vane's riders are experienced, they'll identify the split within 10 minutes. 10 minutes is enough, she said. The timberline is 4 minutes west at full gallop. Once we're in the high timber, tracking 15 horses becomes tracking 8, and the trail goes cold fast in this kind of snow. He was already signaling his men. They split at speed. 4 riders broke southeast toward the junction, and even from distance, Selene could hear them making themselves known, the specific controlled noise of military riders who understood the assignment. The rest of them drove west at a gallop that left no room for the body to feel anything except the immediate demands of staying mounted on rough, snow-covered ground in the dark. Selene rode. She had ridden since she was 7 years old, and the body memory of it was deeper than thought. The shifts of weight, the communication through the reins, the collaboration between rider and animal that reduces the world to forward momentum and the next visible yard of ground. She rode now with everything she had, the cold, a constant assault on her face and hands, her thighs burning from the pace, the satchel across her body a weight she was aware of with every stride. They hit the timberline in just under 4 minutes. The trees closed around them like a hand. Old growth, the kind that had been standing before any of the empire's administrative boundaries had been drawn, the kind that had its own interior weather and geography and made the world outside seem like a different country. The snow here was different, interrupted by branches, deeper in some places, absent in others where the canopy had held. The horses slowed from necessity, and the noise of their passage became muffled and directional in ways that would confuse any tracker who hadn't grown up in this specific terrain. The western approach, Selene said. 1/2 mile north, Vera said. She had rode those 4 minutes without complaint and arrived at the timberline with her jaw set and her eyes clear. Follow the slope. When you feel the grade increase, we're on it. They followed the slope. Here is what it costs to be the person who carries everyone else's survival on their back. Not just the physical weight, though that is real and underestimated, but the cognitive weight of maintaining the picture while everything around you demands that you abandon the picture and react to the immediate. Selene had carried this weight for 10 years inside a palace, where the stakes were political and the timeline was long. She was carrying it now in frozen timber in the pre-dawn dark, where the stakes were her life and her bloodline and the northern houses that had been waiting 26 years for a reason to believe. And the timeline was whatever gap existed between now and the moment Vane's cavalry identified the split and redirected. She did not drop the picture. She wrote and thought simultaneously, the way she always had. The dual processing that had made her valuable and had cost her, in different ways, everything. The grade increased. They were on the western approach. It was not the road that Selene's imagination had built from Vera's description. It was older than road, Bat. A track, really, the evidence of long use rather than deliberate construction. The path that exists because generations of people have moved through the same space and the ground has learned to accommodate them. In summer, it would have been manageable. In winter, in the dark, with riders who did not know it, it demanded the full attention of every person on it. They climbed for 40 minutes. When they stopped, it was because the track had reached a point where the timber broke open onto a high ridge, and the ridge looked north across a landscape that stopped Selene's breath for reasons that had nothing to do with altitude. The Northern Territory. She had seen maps of it. She had read the fragmentary intelligence. She had built a picture in her mind from incomplete sources, as she built most of her pictures. And the picture had been adequate, functionally representative. What lay before her now was not the picture. It was the thing itself. And the thing itself was larger and older and more itself than any representation had suggested. Mountains in the middle distance, the true Varick Range, with the snowfields below them catching the first gray light and throwing it back in a way that made the horizon look like it was lit from underneath. Dark settlements along the valley floor, not many, but present. The lights of fires that burned through the night. The evidence of people who had made their lives in terrain that most of the continent had decided was not worth making a life in. The sky above was enormous in the way that high-altitude skies are enormous. A different scale than anything below the ridge. Selene looked at it. She felt the frequency in her blood respond to it the way a voice responds when it finds the room it was built for. Suddenly at full volume, suddenly resonant, suddenly not fighting its own echo. "My lady," Harwick's voice, quiet. She turned. Below and behind them, at the timberline, she could see movement, torchlight. Vane's cavalry had found the split faster than 10 minutes. "How far to the first house?" she said to Vera. "The 2 hours on the northern slope at this pace," Vera said. "But the slope is exposed for the first mile. If they have eyes on the ridge—" "They already do," Harwick said. He was looking at the torchlight with the professional assessment of a man counting and calculating. 15 riders, maybe 20. They split their force at the timberline. Smart. Whoever commands them is experienced. Selene looked at the exposed slope. A mile of open ground, gray lit by the approaching dawn, on a surface that would hold tracks perfectly and offer nothing in the way of cover. 15 riders behind her and a 2-hour approach to the first northern house ahead. Then she looked at the ring. And she thought about something Vera had said at the work table, in a different room in what felt like a different life. The bloodline responds to recognition. You've been carrying something dormant your entire life. The conditions haven't been right to wake it. She had assumed dormant meant waiting. She had not considered what it might mean to wake it fully. "Harwick," she said, "take your men and Vera down the northern slope, fast as the ground allows. Don't wait for me." Harwick looked at her. "My lady." "That's an order," she said. And the way she said it, not with the borrowed authority of proximity to Riker's throne, but with something older and more structural, made his argument stop before it reached his mouth. She watched him feel the difference, watched him respond to it the way the men had responded to it when she had signaled the split, without needing to understand it entirely, just needing to trust the person who carried it. "Go," she said. They went. She turned her horse to face the timberline. The torchlight was closer. She could see the shapes of riders now, not just light, could see the organization of them, the experienced spread of a cavalry that knew what it was doing. Lord Edric Vane had not sent fools. She would give him that. What happened next was not something Selene could have described, then or later, with any precision that would have satisfied a skeptic. She was a strategic mind, a political animal, a woman built from evidence and analysis and the accumulated learning of 10 years in the most demanding court on the continent. She was not, by any history or habit, a person who operated by instinct over calculation. But the frequency in her blood had been building for 40 minutes on a grade that felt like it was designed to receive it. And when she sat on that ridge in the first gray light of a winter dawn, with her face to the wind and her right hand closed around the reins and the ring against her palm, the frequency stopped being something she was standing in. It became something she was standing on. The change was physical, She felt it in her spine first, then her chest, then the back of her skull. Not pain, not heat, not any familiar sensation, but something that had no name because she had never had it before and there was no prior experience to name it from. The ring stone shifted in color, from the pre-dawn sky shade to something brighter, the color of the moment after sunrise, and the mark inside it, the overlapping crescents, pulsed once with a light that had no business being visible in daylight. The horses at the timberline stopped. All of them. Not from command. Their riders had not signaled. They simply stopped, the way animals stop when they encounter something their instincts do not have a category for. The torchlight held its position. The riders, she could see even at this distance, were holding their horses rather than directing them. The posture of people managing animals that have decided not to move. Selene looked at them across the open slope. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She simply looked, with the full weight of what was running in her blood and what was lit in the ring on her hand, and she held that weight outward the way you hold a shield, not as aggression, but as fact. Then she turned her horse north and rode. She caught Harwick's group within a quarter mile. He looked back at her approach and at the ridge behind her. Empty. The torchlight stationary, no pursuit. And she watched his face process something he did not have a framework for. She did not explain it. She was not certain she could. They rode. The northern slope was harder than the ridge. The track narrow and the surface treacherous in the way that descents in winter are always more dangerous than ascents. The weight of the horse fighting forward momentum, the constant negotiation with gravity. Selene rode it with her attention fully on the ground and her body doing the work that 10 years of intermittent riding had prepared it for, and the frequency in her blood ran steady and directional. Like a compass needle that had found north and had no interest in anything else. 2 hours. 2 hours of slope and cold, and the smell of high timber and the sound of 8 riders moving through country that had not seen this kind of passage in a generation. The light grew as they descended, full gray, then the first suggestion of actual color as the sun found the eastern ridge. The valley settlements below resolved from dark shapes to visible structures, stone and timber, built for endurance rather than display. They were perhaps 20 minutes from the valley floor when the riders appeared ahead. Not cavalry, not a military formation. 7 riders spread loosely across the track in the way of people who are present rather than deployed, who have come to see rather than to stop. They wore no insignia Selene recognized, no colors that matched anything in her knowledge of the continent's political families. They wore winter gear that was functional and heavy and looked like it had seen many winters. They stopped when Harwick's group stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the rider in the center, a man perhaps 60 years old, with a face the texture of the terrain they were riding through, weathered into something that looked like it would last. Looked past Harwick, past the soldiers, directly at Selene. He looked at her hand, at the ring, at the light that had not entirely faded from the stone. He got off his horse. He did not kneel at the formal way of Southern court tradition, the one-knee, head-down performance of hierarchy that Selene had watched hundreds of times in Ashbourne Palace. He did something different. He stood on the snow-covered ground and he pressed both hands to his chest, over his heart, and he held her gaze with the directness of someone who is not performing deference, but expressing recognition. "The Varick Heir," he said. His voice was rough from the cold and from a lifetime of speaking into wind. "We've been watching the ridge since midnight. When the torchlight stopped on the slope," he paused. "We knew." Selene looked at him. "What is your house?" she said. "Aldrich of the First House," he said. "My family has held the Northern Valley since before the Moonfire Empire existed. Since before any empire on this continent existed." He looked at her with the plain, unornamented attention of a man who has spent his life dealing in realities rather than performances. "You look like your mother." The words arrived differently than she expected. Not as sentimentality. She had not known her mother, had 3 years of memory at most, and what she had was less memory than impression, warmth, and a voice she could not reproduce. But the words arrived as confirmation of something that the ring and the frequency had already told her in a language below language. She was real, not as Riker's Luna, not as a political instrument, not as the strategic mind that had kept an empire from tearing itself apart, as herself. The original herself. The one that had existed before anyone put a use on her. "We have a great deal to discuss," she said to Aldrich. "We do," he said, "and not much time to discuss it. Whatever stopped those riders on the slope—" He looked at the ring, at her. "It won't hold forever." "No," she said. "It won't." She dismounted. Her boots hit the northern ground, and the frequency in her blood, which had been a continuous held note for hours, shifted, deepened, settled, became something so integrated with her physical awareness that she stopped being able to separate it from herself. She had arrived, not at a destination she had planned, at one she had been built for. And 200 miles south, in a palace that bore the results of her 10 years of work, something was happening that none of her planning had accounted for. Riker Ashbourne had found the letter, not the copy Harwick held. The original, the one Aurelia's attendant had been sent to retrieve from wherever it had gone, the retrieval that had failed. In the process of that failure, in the search conducted quietly through the palace's correspondence channels in the hours before dawn, a search that had been authorized by Aurelia but not flagged to the king, Riker had noticed what he was not supposed to notice. He was in Aurelia's chambers. He had come because she had sent for him, which she did regularly, which he had come to understand as the rhythm of their arrangement. She had not expected him early. The attendant, in the process of the search, had been careless with a secondary document, a record of correspondence, dates, and recipients that matched no version of Aurelia's history that she had provided him. He was looking at it when she came out of the inner room. He looked at her. She looked at the document in his hand. The warmth that had lived in her face since the first evening she had spent in his company, the calibrated warmth, the relief-giving warmth, the warmth that had made him lean toward her voice in a banquet hall while his Luna sat 3 seats away, was gone. What replaced it was considerably colder and considerably more honest. "Riker," she said. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit. They looked at each other across the cold morning light of her chambers. A king who had just discovered the dimensions of the cage he had been living in, and a woman who had built the cage and was now calculating, with the specific speed of a cornered intelligence, what her remaining options were. "The child," he said. She said nothing. "Is there a child?" he said. The silence lasted precisely long enough for him to have his answer. Riker Ashbourne had faced betrayal before. His brother, 2 generals, a lord whose allegiance had been purchased under false terms. He had faced each of these with the controlled fury of a man who has learned to process rage as information rather than expression, to channel it into action rather than expend it in reaction. This was different. This was not the betrayal of an ally or a subordinate. This was the betrayal of the man who lived inside the king, the person who had needed, underneath all the weight of sovereignty, to be seen without agenda, who had found something that felt like that and had walked into it without checking the floor. He felt the weight of Selene's absence as he stood in that room in a way he had not allowed himself to feel it since the banquet. He felt what he had thrown away. Not strategically, he had understood the strategic implications for days. He felt it in the body, in the chest, in the specific physical location where people keep the things they don't examine until the loss makes examination unavoidable. He had thrown away the realest thing he'd had, for a floor that was never there. "Tell me who sent you," he said. His voice was very quiet. Aurelia looked at him with the eyes of someone deciding whether the truth costs more than the lie at this particular moment. "Tell me," he said again, "because I'm going to find out regardless. And the difference between you telling me now and me finding out another way is the only remaining question of any significance in this conversation." The winter morning held its breath, and Aurelia Thorne, who had been many things in the service of an architecture she had not built but had been trained to maintain, made the calculation that the king in front of her was no longer a managed piece on a board. He was an alpha who had just lost everything, and she had been in proximity to enough powerful men to know exactly how dangerous that was. She opened her mouth, and the name she said was one that Selene Ravenwood, 200 miles north on a mountain track with a burning ring on her hand, would not hear until it was too late to change what it set in motion. A name that rewrote the architecture of everything. A name that meant the real war had not yet begun. The name Aurelia spoke was Lord Cassius Vane, not Edric, not the Eastern Branch cousin who had served as the operational hand. Cassius, The lord whose estate taxes Selene had personally negotiated. The man who had leaned toward his wife at the banquet and whispered something that made her smile. The man who had been, in every intelligence assessment Selene had ever produced for Riker's court, categorized as a cooperative ally with selective loyalty tendencies, manageable, monitored, not a threat. The man whose cooperation Selene had purchased 2 years ago with a tax arrangement that gave him exactly enough financial relief to fund a long-distance operation without it showing in any account that the Crown's administrators would flag. She had, without knowing it, partially financed her own displacement. Riker stood in Aurelia's chambers with this name in the air between them and felt the specific quality of rage that comes not from surprise but from recognition. The rage of a man who sees suddenly and completely the shape of the thing that has been done to him, and understands that some portion of it was done with materials he himself provided. He had been managed, not by a woman who had found his vulnerability and exploited it, though that was also true. He had been managed by a network that had been in place before Aurelia arrived, before the mating ceremony was announced, before the Western campaign that had taken Selene away for 6 weeks and left the space that Aurelia had walked into. Lord Cassius Vane had been working this architecture for years, with patience and resources and the specific long-game intelligence of a man who understood that the most durable power is not seized, but grown. Aurelia told him everything. Not from remorse. From the calculation that Cassius Vane had already lost the operational advantage, the letter was gone, the cavalry on the ridge had failed, and whatever had happened on that slope in the pre-dawn dark had shifted something in the northern approach that she did not fully understand but recognized as outside the scope of her preparation. She told him because a sinking structure offers nothing to the people clinging to it, and Aurelia Thorne had survived too long and too skillfully to go down with anyone else's ship. She told him about the network, about Edric Vane's operational role, about the correspondence chain that ran through 4 eastern houses, about the plan to control the northern bloodline heir by controlling the conditions of her awakening, not eliminating Selene, never eliminating her because a dead heir was a claim that died with her, but isolating her, directing her, ensuring that when the northern houses recognized her sovereignty, the recognition came with strings attached to hands in Veltharion. She told him about the child. There was no child. There had never been a child. The claim had been a lever, precisely calibrated to the specific pressure point of a king who had no legitimate heir and who had been quietly, methodically, made to feel that his Luna was a partner rather than a person, competent, indispensable, and somehow not enough. Riker listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "You should leave this palace," he said. "Today, before I finish this conversation." Aurelia looked at him with the eyes of someone who has made peace, in advance, with outcomes. She had known, when she chose this work, that exits were part of the structure. She had planned for them. She left. Riker stood in the room she had occupied for 4 months, in the middle of the wreckage of the most significant mistake of his life. And he did something he had not done since the first year of his reign, when his brother's betrayal had left him alone in a war camp with a tactical defeat and no clear forward path. He sat down on the floor, not in collapse, in the deliberate way of a man who needs the ground under him to think, who needs to be closer to something real than any chair or throne allows. He sat on the stone floor of Aurelia Thorne's former chambers, and he looked at his hands and he thought about Selene. Not strategically, not politically. He thought about the quarry 3 years ago. The limestone versus the black marble, the rain on her face, the absolute certainty in her voice when she said it feels weak. He thought about the war council where she had walked into a room of generals who wanted her absent and had turned a losing strategy into a campaign that saved 3,000 lives without raising her voice once. He thought about the war camp, the very first night, the map in his hands and 30 seconds of her silence before she pointed to the error, and the 2 words he had said, "All right," that had been the beginning of everything. He thought about what she had said in his study. "I was holding the edge of something massive, so you could stand in the center of it without being pulled apart." He had called it suffocating. He had called her gaze management. He understood now, sitting on the floor in the cold morning light, what he had actually been saying. He had not been describing her failure. He had been describing his own inability to receive what she was giving without feeling diminished by the receiving. the specific, corrosive pride of a powerful man who cannot accept help without hearing it as commentary on his need for it. She had been holding the edge. He had wanted to believe he didn't need the edge held, and Aurelia had offered him the version of himself that didn't, the simplified version, the one that wasn't constantly measured against the weight of real stakes, the one that got to be relieved without cost. He had chosen the comfortable lie over the demanding truth. This was not a small thing to sit with. He sat with it anyway. This is what genuine reckoning costs. Not the dramatic gesture, not the public acknowledgement, not even the apology, but the private moment when a person stops managing their own narrative and simply looks at what they did and what it means about who they are. Most people flinch from this. Most people find a way to soften the image, to introduce mitigating circumstances, to arrive at a version of the truth that leaves them with enough standing to function. Riker Ashbourne sat on a cold stone floor and did not soften it. He looked at the full shape of his failure, the personal and the political, the calculated and the instinctive, and he did not look away. This was the first honest thing he had done in 4 months. He was on his feet within the hour. He did not go to Lord Cassius Vane immediately, because what he needed to do with Cassius Vane required preparation and witnesses and the full machinery of royal accountability, and the machinery needed to be assembled correctly so it could not be dismantled by the Vane network's remaining legal resources. He went to Harwick's adjutant first, discovered Harwick was absent from the barracks, understood what that meant, and felt the particular quality of gratitude that belongs to generals who act before they are asked. He went to Lord Marin next. She opened her door and looked at his face and said, without preamble, "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need your house's formal witness to a treason proceeding," he said, "and an honest answer to a question I should have asked you 6 weeks ago." Lady Marin looked at him for a moment, the long, assessing look of a woman who has spent 50 years deciding which men were worth the investment of her house's political capital. "Come in," she said. They talked for an hour. When Riker left Marin's chambers, he had 3 things he had not had before: a formal witness, a secondary intelligence record that Marin had been maintaining about Eastern House activity for the past year out of the precise instinct that had kept House Castor solvent through 3 regime changes, and a clear picture of the full network that Cassius Vane had built. It was larger than he had imagined. It was also, now that it was visible, identifiable at every joint. And identifiable structures, in Riker Ashbourne's experience, did not survive contact with his attention. He moved through the day with the specific focus of a man who has stopped carrying anything except the immediate task. The treason proceeding against Cassius Vane was initiated through the court's formal channels before midday, with Marin's witness and 3 pieces of documentary evidence that Harwick's secondary letter provided. Edric Vane was taken into custody by mid-afternoon through the Eastern Territory's own administrative structure, because Riker had, in 10 years, built relationships with the territorial administrators that bypassed the lords, and those relationships held. The network collapsed in the way that networks collapse when their architecture is exposed, not all at once, but in cascade, each connection becoming a liability rather than a resource the moment the people holding it understood that the center had given way. By nightfall, what Cassius Vane had spent years building was in formal legal proceedings. By nightfall, Riker Ashbourne was standing at a window in his study looking north. There are victories that feel like victories. Tactical wins, strategic consolidations, the satisfaction of a problem solved and a threat neutralized. He had won those kinds of victories many times, and he knew their particular quality, the clean, energizing feeling of a thing completed. This did not feel like that. The network was dismantled, the conspiracy was exposed, the Empire's political structure, destabilized by Aurelia's 4 months of patient manipulation, was already beginning to reassert itself as the news moved through the court that Lord Vane had been brought up on treason charges, and the royal companion had departed the palace. Lady Marin had communicated to 4 other houses before dinner. The Eastern Territory lords who had been positioning themselves around Vane's alliance were, with the specific speed of political animals identifying a change in wind direction in the process of repositioning. The Empire would stabilize. Riker knew this. What he didn't know, what he stood at the window thinking about, with the north dark beyond the glass and the snow still deep on the palace grounds, was whether the thing he had lost in the process of saving the Empire was the kind of thing that could be recovered. He had thrown Selene away, not metaphorically, not accidentally. He had stood at that banquet table and he had chosen, in front of every power in his court, a managed comfort over a real person. He had done it consciously, believing he was choosing something he needed, and he had been wrong about what he needed in the most expensive way a person can be wrong. She was in the north now. He did not know exactly where. The riders he sent to the Varick approach had come back with the report of a cavalry that had held at the timberline for reasons none of them could articulate, of tracks that led west and then became confused in high timber, of a ridge where something had happened in the pre-dawn dark that the soldiers spoke of with the uncertain language of people describing an experience that fell outside their available vocabulary. She had made it through. He was certain of this the way he was certain of very few things, not from evidence, but from the specific knowledge of what Selene Ravenwood was capable of when she had nothing left to lose and a direction to move in. He thought about going after her. He sat with this thought long enough to examine it honestly. The impulse was real. The urgency behind it was real. He wanted to ride north. He wanted to cover the distance between them and stand in front of her and say the things that had been accumulating since the banquet, since the study, since the corridor where she had walked away from him through the palace's black marble halls with his ring gone from her hand. But he had done enough in his life by impulse wearing the clothing of certainty. What he owed her was not urgency. What he owed her was the truth of what he had become in the time since she left, and the willingness to deliver it on her terms rather than his own. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. He did not expect to. The recognition ceremony of the Northern Moon Dominion took place 3 days after Selene arrived at Aldrich's house, which sat at the valley floor beneath the first line of the Varick range like a thing grown rather than built. Stone walls 2 feet thick, timber beams blackened from decades of fire. Floors worn smooth by generations of feet that had crossed them with the weight of real lives. The ceremony was not the kind Selene had spent 10 years attending. There were no chandeliers, no formal gowns, no ordered seating and strategic placement, and the theatrical architecture of Southern court power. There were 7 house leaders, the oldest families of the Northern Valley, sitting around a table that had been used for decisions for longer than the Ashbourne dynasty had existed. There was a fire large enough to heat the room without gesture. There was Vara, who had made the descent with Harwick's men and arrived at Aldrich's house looking like someone who had been on a hard road and was exactly where she was supposed to be. There was Harwick, who sat in the corner with the quiet presence of a man who understood that this was not his ceremony, but whose being there was itself a statement about where his loyalty had decided to live. And there was Selene, in the practical dark wool she had ridden north in, with road dust and dried snow on her boots, and her hair loose because she had not had occasion to put it up, and had found, in the north, that she did not particularly want to. The ring on her hand had settled back to its pre-dawn sky color. The frequency in her blood had found its register and stayed there. Not intrusive, not demanding, simply present, like a heartbeat that had been running slightly wrong for 30 years and had finally found its correct rhythm. Aldrich spoke the recognition in the old form, which Vera had taught Selene on the descent, the words of a language that predated the continent's current political lingua and sounded like the landscape itself, angular and enduring and certain of its own weight. The other 6 house leaders spoke after him, each in turn, each with their hands pressed to their chests, in the gesture she had first seen on the ridge. She did not cry. She came close, not from ceremony. She had attended enough ceremonies to be largely immune to their emotional engineering. She came close because of Aldrich's face when he finished speaking, because of the specific quality of his expression, which was not the expression of a man completing a political process, but of a man who has been carrying a responsibility for a long time and has just been able to set it down. The relief of someone who has kept something safe long enough to deliver it to the person it belonged to. She understood that feeling better than she had 3 days ago. "The dominion is yours," Aldrich said, in the southern tongue, when the formal words were done. "Not as a gift, not as a grant, as a return." "I know," she said. She meant it. What followed was not a celebration. It was work. Selene was constitutionally incapable of treating a political inheritance as an occasion for rest, and the northern houses, it turned out, were constitutionally incapable of respecting a leader who could. Within 2 hours of the formal recognition, she was at the table with maps and the 7 house leaders and Harwick, building the picture of what the Dominion actually was. its population, its resource landscape, its internal political tensions, the alliances and the grievances and the long memories of a people who had been governing themselves without external structure for a generation, and had developed strong opinions about how things should work. They were not a broken people. Vera had been right about that. They were a people who had been waiting for someone to build with, rather than someone to build for. The distinction mattered enormously. She worked through 2 days without sleeping more than 4 hours on either night, which Harwick monitored with the silent vigilance of a man who had decided, apparently, that his 40-year military career had been a preparation for this specific assignment. On the third morning, he put a cup of something hot in front of her at the table and said, with the flat authority of a general who has decided that authority applies in all directions, "Drink that, then sleep. The Dominion will exist in 4 hours." She drank it. She slept. She dreamed for the first time in the north of the palace, of the black marble corridor, the iron sconces, the amber light. In the dream, she walked the length of it, and the corridor did not feel like loss. It felt like something she had moved through on her way to where she was going. The past as passage rather than definition. She woke up clearer than she had been in 10 years. On the 5th day, the rider came from the south. He arrived at Aldrich's house in the early afternoon, road-worn and cold, with the Ashbourne seal on his dispatch bag, and a letter that he delivered to Selene with the careful formality of someone who had been instructed to be careful and was taking the instruction seriously. She took the letter outside. She sat on a stone wall that looked north at the mountains and south at the valley and read it there, in the cold, where the light was honest and the air did not carry anyone else's agenda. Riker's handwriting. She knew it the way she knew his voice, the left-handed heavy ink, the letters that leaned slightly forward as if in a hurry, the places where he pressed too hard when the thought was something he needed to fix to the page rather than let drift. The letter was not long. He did not explain himself. He had explained himself in the study, inadequately, and he appeared to understand that further explanation was not what was owed. He told her about Cassius Vane, about Aurelia, about the name and the network, and the proceeding that was dismantling it. He told her these things not to claim credit for addressing them, but because they were facts she needed and she deserved to receive them from him rather than through secondary channels. Then he wrote one paragraph that was not about the Empire. He wrote, "I have been trying to find the correct thing to say to you since the morning you walked out of my study, and I have not found it. And I am beginning to understand that the reason I cannot find it is that there is no correct thing. There is only the truth, which is that I valued what you gave me without understanding what it cost you to give it, and I called my incapacity to receive it your failure, and I was wrong. Not strategically wrong. Wrong in the way that matters more than strategy. I am not asking you to return. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you what I know now that I did not know before, because you always told me that incomplete intelligence was more dangerous than no intelligence, and you deserve to have the complete picture." She read this paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter along its original creases and held it in her hands for a moment in the mountain cold, with the north at her back and the south ahead. This is the thing about love after damage. It does not simply reconstitute itself in the shape it previously held. The original shape is gone, modified irrevocably by the pressure that was applied to it. What remains is something different, not lesser necessarily, not greater automatically, but genuinely different in the way that metal is different after it has been through enough heat, changed in its grain, its flexibility, its relationship to force. Sometimes the change makes it stronger. Sometimes it reveals fractures that were always there. You cannot know which until you test the new shape under actual weight. Selene was not ready to test any new shape. She was still in the process of understanding the one she was currently in. She wrote back, "Not that day." She took 3 days with the letter, which was unlike her. She was not generally a person who required 3 days to compose her thoughts. But this was not a strategic document. It was not a political communication. It was an honest one, which was harder, which required the kind of patience with herself that she had more easily applied to everything else in the world. She wrote, "What you built is real. What I helped you build is real. The mistake you made does not undo either of those things, but it also does not erase itself. I am not in a position to tell you what forgiveness looks like yet, because I'm still in the process of understanding what I am in the absence of the person I was beside you." That process takes the time it takes. What I can tell you is that I received your letter and read it and believed it, and that believing it matters, even when I am not certain what to do with the belief." She paused, added one more line. "The Empire needs a Luna who chooses it, not one who was placed beside it. If you understand the difference now, then some good has come from all of this." She sent it. The months that followed built themselves from work and weather and the specific day-by-day accumulation of a leader finding her shape. Selene governed the Northern Moon Dominion with the same methodical intelligence she had applied to the Moonfire Empire's crises, but differently. Not because the intelligence had changed, but because the foundation under it had. She was building something that was hers. Every decision carried a different weight when its consequences landed on her own chosen ground rather than someone else's borrowed one. The Northern houses responded to her in the way that people respond to genuine leadership, not with the performed loyalty of political calculation, but with the practical commitment of people who have assessed a person and decided they are worth following. Aldrich became the closest thing she had to a council. Harwick, who had apparently decided that retirement was for people with less urgent things to do, remained through the winter and into the spring, training the Dominion's territorial guard with the brisk competence of a man who had been waiting for a project worthy of the last decade of his career. Vara remained too. Their relationship had become something that did not have a clean name. Not mentor, not ally, not the managed trust of a political arrangement. Something more complicated and more honest than any of those. The relationship of two people who have seen each other in the full light of imperfect motivation and decided to proceed anyway. Selene did not forget what Vera's Eastern contacts had meant. She also did not forget what Vera had carried for 26 years, alone, in the service of a bloodline she believed in. People were their complicated entireties. She had always known this. She was learning to apply it with less perfection and more patience. The letter from Riker arrived every month, not demanding, not escalating. They were, after the first several, less about the wreckage and more about the present. What was happening in the Empire? What she was building in the North? The specific kind of conversation that had once happened in person across 10 years of shared purpose and was now happening across 200 miles in a mountain range. She wrote back each time. The letters grew longer. The gap between what was said and what was meant grew smaller. She did not miss him less. She missed him differently, more honestly. Without the specific distortion of missing that is actually the absence of the person you required yourself to be around them, without the weight of the role embedded in the person. What she missed now was the man she had known in the moments between the role, the quarry argument, the war camp map, the two words that had started everything. The actual person, flawed and capable and catastrophically blind in a specific direction and more honest than most people she had encountered about the things that mattered to him. This kind of missing was something she could live inside. She did not dissolve in it. She carried it the way you carry things that are genuinely yours, as part of the weight, not as the whole of it. Spring came to the Northern Valley the way spring comes to high terrain, late and argumentative, arriving in pieces, the cold pushing back against each advance of warmth, until finally the warmth accumulated critical mass and the snow retreated to the highest ridges, and the valley floor turned the particular improbable green of a world that has survived another winter and is not subtle about it. Riker came in late spring. He did not announce himself in advance, which was either courtesy or caution. She was not certain which, and suspected it was both. He arrived with 4 riders and no formal escort, in traveling gear rather than court dress, and he had been on the road long enough that the dust of it was in the lines of his face, and the dark under his eyes said the journey had not been comfortable. Aldrich's people brought word to the Valley House, where Selene was at her table with a territorial water rights dispute that had been simmering between 2 northern families for a season and needed resolution before the summer irrigation cycle began. She put down the document. She went outside. He was dismounting in the yard when she came through the door. He saw her immediately. He had always had that quality, the awareness of a room or a space that meant he rarely needed to search for what he was looking for. He went still when he saw her. She stopped at the top of the steps. They looked at each other across the yard of Aldrich's house, in the spring light, with the mountains behind her and the southern road behind him, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. He looked different, not in any dramatic way. He was the same person, physically unchanged, the scar on his jaw, the width of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man who has learned to hold his own tension internally rather than exporting it. But something in the way he held himself was different. The specific set of his posture that had always carried a slight quality of performance, the deliberate maintenance of the alpha in public space, was gone. What remained was simply a man, tired from a long road, standing in a yard in the mountains. She was not immune to this. She was not trying to be. He crossed the yard. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. And she saw in his face the particular quality of a person who has rehearsed something and abandoned the rehearsal and arrived in the actual moment with nothing but the truth. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," he said. His voice was quiet. "I want you to know that first." "Then why are you here?" she said. "Because the letters aren't enough anymore," he said. "Because what I need to say needs to be said in the same room." He held her gaze without flinching, and she thought about all the times she had watched him face difficult truths and all the ways he had managed the managing of himself in those moments, and how entirely absent that management was right now. "I failed you, not only in the ways that were engineered, not only because of Cassius Vane's network or Aurelia's manipulation. I failed you in the ways that were entirely mine. My pride, my need to be the one who wasn't carried, my inability to understand that being held by someone who loves you is not the same thing as being diminished by them." He stopped. "I have been living in that understanding for 7 months. I'm not going to tell you that understanding it fixes it. I'm telling you that I understand it." She looked at him for a long time. There's a specific quality of silence that exists between people who have known each other deeply and are in the process of determining what that depth means after damage. It is not empty silence. It is dense with everything that cannot be reduced to language. The accumulated history of two people's actual experience of each other, the knowledge that goes below word into the cellular record of years shared, arguments survived, the specific quality of another person's presence in the dark. She had not planned what she would say if this moment arrived. She had learned, in the North, to work with less planning than she had previously required. "I know you understand it," she said. "I've been reading you for 10 years. I can tell the difference between when you're managing your understanding of something and when you actually have it." She came down 2 steps. They were level now, eye to eye. "That doesn't mean I know what to do with it." "I know," he said. "I'm not the person I was," she said. "I'm not your Luna. I'm not the woman who managed the edge of your empire. I'm something I'm still in the process of figuring out, and that process doesn't have a set timeline, and I will not compress it for the sake of any feeling either of us has." "I know," he said again. "And the dominion is mine," she said. "That doesn't change. Whatever happens between us, this territory, this sovereignty, this work, this is mine. It does not become contingent on anything else." "It shouldn't," he said. "It never should have been contingent on anything. You should have known what you carried before you were old enough to be traded by your father. You should have had this ground under your feet the whole time." Something crossed his face, a pain that was not performed. "I'm sorry I was part of the structure that kept it from you." She looked at him. This was the thing she had not been able to say in a letter, could only say here, in person, with the full weight of the North behind her and 10 years of shared history between them and the spring light making no effort to be anything other than what it was. "I don't hate you," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think you may have been uncertain. I'm not doing this." She gestured, a small gesture that encompassed the house and the valley and the mountains and everything she had built in the months since the banquet. "I'm not doing this as answer to what you did. I'm doing it because it's mine and it was always mine and I should have known it sooner." She paused. "You were not the origin of my erasure. You were where I practiced it. That distinction matters to me." He was quiet for a moment. "You're the most honest person I've ever known," he said. "I know," she said. "It's occasionally exhausting." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The specific expression of a man who has been in darkness long enough that even the suggestion of familiar light is something to be careful with. "What do you want?" he said. "From this. From whatever this is." She thought about the question with the full attention it deserved. "Time," she said finally. "More letters. Your honesty, which I have always been able to rely on even when everything else was managed. And..." She looked at him, at the tired face and the absent performance, and the man underneath the king that she had known in the actual moments of 10 years. "Your presence," Sometimes. Not as a king visiting a queen, not as an alpha accounting for his decisions. As the person I knew in the war camp before either of us had a role to perform. He held her gaze. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "You couldn't have come here the way you came here if you couldn't." She stepped back and opened the door behind her. "Come inside," she said. "You've ridden for 4 days. The north owes you nothing, but the valley owes everyone warmth." He came inside. He ate at the table where she worked. He spoke with Aldrich, who assessed him with the thorough patience of a man who has been evaluating people for 60 years and does not rush his conclusions. He spoke with Harwick, who shook his hand with the particular grip of a soldier, acknowledging someone who has, by his assessment, earned the acknowledgement. He did not try to be the king. He was simply Riker. And she was simply Selene. And between those two simplies was all the complexity of two people who had known each other in deep ways and broken badly and were willing, carefully, with clear eyes and no illusions about the difficulty of it, to know each other again in a new shape. That night, after the house had gone quiet and the fire had burned to the deep red stage that meant several hours of heat still remaining, they sat at the table across from each other with the water rights document and the northern maps and a cup of something warm between them, and they talked. Not about the Empire, not about the Dominion, not about what happened or what should have happened, about the quarry, about the limestone versus the black marble. She told him she had thought about that argument in the first week of building the Dominion's Valley House, when the local stone was a gray she didn't love, and she'd had to make the choice between what was available and what was right. "What did you choose?" he said. "The gray," she said, "because the gray was the stone of this place. You build with what belongs to the ground you're on." He looked at her. "That's the difference," he said quietly, "between what you build for yourself and what you build for someone else." "Yes," she said. "It is." The fire burned. The mountain night pressed against the windows, cold and enormous, the kind of dark that only exists at altitude where the sky is not diluted by city light. And in that dark, in that room, two people who had known each other in the wrong configuration sat in something that was not yet repaired and not yet resolved, but was, for the first time in 10 years, genuinely honest. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. This is the lesson that neither the crown nor the throne, nor any architecture of power can teach, but that life administers eventually to everyone who survives long enough to receive it. The measure of a person is not how much they conquer, but how much truth they can stand to live inside. Riker Ashbourne had conquered an empire and could not stand inside a single honest conversation with the woman who loved him. Selene Ravenwood had built that empire's foundations and could not stand inside the honest conversation with herself about what she was carrying and why. They had both, in their different ways, been afraid of the full weight of their own lives. The fear had cost them enormously. What remained after the cost was what they actually were. And what they actually were, flawed, changed, no longer performing anything, standing on their separate grounds with the full weight of who they had become through everything they had survived, was enough to build something real with, if they chose. The choosing was not the ending. The choosing was the beginning. Under Selene's governance, the Northern Moon Dominion became, within 3 years, the most prosperous independent sovereign territory on the continent, not through military expansion, but through the patient, intelligent accumulation of productive alliances with people who recognized genuine leadership when they lived under it. Trade routes opened. The Northern Valley's resources, which had been kept provincial through 3 generations of political isolation, entered the continent's economy on terms that Selene negotiated personally, with the same methodical precision she had applied to Riker's border treaties, now applied to her own. Riker rebuilt the Moonfire Empire on the honest foundation that replaced the compromised one. It was harder than the original construction. Truth always asks more of the builder than comfortable fiction does. He asked more of his council, more of his lords, more of himself. He did not always get what he asked for. He persisted. The two sovereignties did not merge. That was not the story. The story was two entities, distinct and sovereign, with a relationship between them that was not contingent on merger. Trade agreements, military mutual defense structures, a correspondence that continued, deepened, and became, over time, the most honest conversation either of them had ever sustained. On certain springs, he came north. On certain winters, she came south. Neither of them called it what it was out loud. They both knew what it was. The Moonstone Ring. Riker's ring, the one from the war camp, the one she had left on the throne in the final public gesture before she walked away. She had retrieved before she left. She had not worn it on her right hand again. But she had not discarded it either. She kept it on the table in the Valley House, beside the maps, beside the armory report she had brought north in a leather satchel, beside the old stone of the place she had built with what belonged to the ground she was standing on. Sometimes she looked at it. It did not mean what it had meant. It meant something else now, something without a clean name, like most of the things that mattered. She could live with that. She had learned in the North, in the months of work and cold, and the slow accumulation of a self she had always been and never inhabited, that the most important things rarely had clean names. That the people who insisted on clean names for everything were usually the ones who had not yet been through enough to understand that life does not resolve into categories. It resolves into moments, some of them hard, some of them true, all of them yours, if you're willing to stand in them without looking away. She was willing. She had always been willing. She just hadn't known, until the year she lost everything, that willing was enough. The Northern Moon Dominion still stands. So does the Moonfire Empire. And in the high valley where the Varick Mountains meet the spring sky, the woman who was once called Aluna, who had already been replaced before wearing a crown, walks the stone corridors of a house she built from the ground, of a territory that was always hers. And she does not look like someone who lost. She looks like someone who finally arrived.